So I move that we adopt the agenda as presented. Motion by Director McLeod, by Director Vogel to approve the agenda. Further questions? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Let's move to agenda. Second by Director Gallagher. Further discussion? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by aye, please. Opposed? Motion carries. Now to number 3, approve and or remove consent agenda items. Motion by Director Wells, second by Director Hawkins to approve the consent agenda. Further discussion? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Now to agenda item number 4, board meeting dates in 2018. Mainly just a discussion or clarification. Any questions on that? Being none, let's move to agenda item number 5, Director's Report. Director Randall, would you like to have a little bit more time? Go ahead. Great. At this time, I will call on Executive Director DNR, Director Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, directors. Sorry to be nearly late this morning. I usually like to get the chance to visit with y'all before we sit down and settle in, but hope to catch up with everybody on a break. So ultimately, I think to say Happy New Year, because it's the first time I've seen many of you. The General Assembly started 15 days ago. The department had with our 2 major oversight hearings, the SMART Act hearing and our CWCB hearing in December. So we've gotten those out of the way and don't have to start the year with those. There was a lot of discussion in each of those sessions with the General Assembly about severance tax, which we'll hear a lot about this morning as well. But I guess I just want to share that not only is that very much on your minds and our minds, but also on the minds of those who are engaged with the department at the legislature. So a modest handful of department bills that we're pursuing. I'll just touch on those really briefly and can provide updates as the General Assembly wears on. First is the approximate future generations bill. I don't know if Director Brochet might touch on that a bit too, but we're in the process of drafting that. We have our sponsors and are working through the drafting process on that. We anticipate legislation addressing orphan wells, a subject that I'll touch on briefly again today. I know I talked about it a bit more in November. A bill being pursued by the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety about sort of small mining permits. So these are for construction material sites that are fewer than 5 acres in size. We did a similar bill for hard rock mining sites to sort of right size the permit requirements and voting requirements and other things in that process for sites that are genuinely smaller than most. So that's again for construction materials, so sand and gravel sites. And then finally, a bill that would give the department, in particular the state land board, the ability to accept gifts, grants, and donations. Vast majority, as Director George might recall, they can accept those gifts, grants, and donations now. They just can't spend. So this is a bill that would give them the ability to put those donations to use. So again, I'll provide updates over the course of the session on those bills. A couple of things on oil and gas I want to touch on. After the Firestone incident last spring, the Oil and Gas Commission required operators to go out and look at and really touch all flow lines within 1,000 feet of an occupied building. Major effort. We brought in data about 120,000 flow lines as part of this review. And now we're engaged in a rulemaking to address flow line requirements. So those are construction requirements, integrity testing and reporting, registration of off-location flow lines. Those are flow lines that are off of the pad. Valves and leak reporting. And it will cover some flow lines that are currently addressed, like crude oil transfer lines and produced water transfer systems. And really just close any regulatory gaps that might exist between the Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, and PHMSA, which is a US DOT. The proposal is to increase it by at least 0.4 mils to really bring back into balance that the funding of the Oil and Gas Commission. Historically, the levy is made up between 60 and 70% of the agency's budget. Because of declines in Illinois, we've made up that difference with severance tax over the last few years. As we all are aware, today doesn't exist. So this year, because severance tax isn't available, we're looking to shore up the revenue from the GCC through increasing the bill. And then finally, yes, I've reported on orphan wells before. We currently get about $500,000 to plug and abandon orphan wells. That has, over the last 5 years, covered between 8 and 15 wells. We have a running inventory of about 244 known sites and several hundred more sites that are require reclamation or that are likely to require plugging in the future. So we continue to seek funding in the short term to address those problems with orphan wells. A couple of things on outdoor recreation I want to touch on. First is the Colorado Outdoor Partnership. This is an effort being convened by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we're really glad to be a part of it. It's a collaborative of leaders across Colorado, business, governments, and NGOs, includes representatives from the agricultural industry, land conservation, and outdoor recreation, hunting and fishing groups, and state officials, and working to ensure public and private lands are viable for wildlife and outdoor agricultural heritage in the state. This has been going on for a few years, or about a year and a half, I guess, and will continue. So that's sort of top of mind these days for me. And then second, this week is the first outdoor retailer show in the state of Colorado. This is a show that's been in Salt Lake City, Utah for 21 years. They recently pulled up stakes and put it out to a national search and decided to come to Denver. The outdoor recreation industry accounts for $887 billion in economic activity nationally. And public lands in the country account for about $35 billion in economic output. So the show is expected to draw almost 50,000 attendees from around the country, and an estimated $45 million to the economy for the Denver area in Colorado. So we're going to be part of that as well. Finally, is the Colorado Community Symposium. This is coming up at the end of this month to look at climate planning and resiliency through some digital workshops working with local governments, looking at the role of government and industry and higher education in addressing sort of climate challenges. So, again, privileged to be part of that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to take any questions.
Questions for Ryan? Let's move to IBCC Director, Dr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the board. The IBCC
January 30th of November is after your last meeting, and we have another meeting scheduled for the 20th of February. And as usual, you're always, this board's always invited to attend. Several board members did attend the last meeting. The last meeting concentrated largely on work plan for the coming year or two. And we discussed and prioritized a number of ideas that we thought were within the purview of the IBCC. As a result of that, we've set up several working groups, one around funding, one around developing a letter for candidates running for the General Assembly and the Governor's Office to kind of give them a background of progress that was being made in the water community, especially through the IBCC efforts. And so this is kind of modeled somewhat after the letter that went out 8 years ago with the change in administration. It was called the letter to the governors, and this kind of got a letter to the future governor, I guess. So we're working on that and can to share it with prospective legislators and kind of get a background of where we're at and working in the water industry and policy issues. Also, I mentioned a funding group, and then also the group that worked on the conceptual framework. It's very broad. And at the meeting in November, we had a really good update from our AG's office and from the Conservation Board staff on the Colorado River system and the negotiation going on there with the lower and with the upper on developing the contingency planning and so I think that was quite interesting. We got good feedback from a number of IBCC members and so I think we'll hear more about some of the future efforts on the part of the Conservation Board staff this coming year when spreading the word in the educational effort. We're going to try to have 4 meetings this coming year, not necessarily quarterly, but we'll have a couple here in the front end of the year and then see what necessitates the next couple of meetings. Compromise. I mean, some people don't want to meet more often, but I think most of us are firm believers, so we're meet as we need to and add value, not just for the sake of meeting. The thing that I appreciate the most, I think, the IBCC is a good spirit, and we have several new members, but good enthusiasm and want to do some positive things. And somewhat other related water issues I'm involved in, we're about to produce a recommendation letter on the high groundwater issue from the groundwater technical committee. Hopefully get that out either later this week or first of next week to share with folks. No silver bullets, but identifying issues and opportunities to tweak things up there. Also coming up in April down in Garden City, Kansas, there's an Oglala summit in which the 8 or 9 states are being invited. Colorado, Colorado State University, and Kansas, as well as Colorado Department are co-sponsoring this in Garden City to take a look at symposiums that we're both participating in. What I'd obviously, if you have questions for Dr. Stone. I don't think so. Please go. I'm sorry. Dr. Stone, I just want to say that our IBCC reps came back and reported to our roundtable in a very positive way. I think that was the sense of this meeting, that to be back together and work. And I think we've got a good momentum going here with this first
cycle here. So congratulations on putting that together. I appreciate you saying that, and I think, keep reminding us, but we have also been able to set it up and put it on your agenda and participate. It makes my report. You've been there and heard the comments.
Further questions for Dr. Schultz?
Let's move to pharmacy, agriculture. Mr. Brown, good morning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that very much. I guess I would have to say that the farmers and ranchers in the world are a little happier today here in Colorado because of the snow that just crop would land in my lap in the fashion that it has, but we're moving along pretty good there. We've got new leadership in Department Ref. The man in marijuana thing a little differently. That's been helpful in certain fashion because of the pesticide application or non-pesticide application. I've been actively involved through the graciousness of Director Randall and Kevin in the Republican River. So I think we've made a lot of progress in the last 2 years. They're currently working on some situations which you're fully aware of. Jackie McClaskey, who is my counterpart there, has water in her shop. I don't here, but I've been involved in that, and I think we've come a long ways toward deciding that it's much cheaper to get along than it is to see each other in court. And I think secondly, one thing that's extremely important is both Jeff Fassett from Nebraska and the Director McClaskey realize that in that community and area out there, that is a regional economy that does not recognize state lines. It does in turn affects their business. We do a lot of business in Kansas. Our signage shoppers come from Kansas, and it was hopefully one day when I was working with Jeff Fassett in Nebraska, and happened to be on one of those days off we occasionally get in this business, which we don't get out there, and I was unloading a load of dried distiller's grain that had come out of Kearney. And I commented, maybe you ought to figure out if you want to keep me in business, maybe we'll keep our own distillers. So anyway, it's been helpful to be involved in that, and I appreciate very much your willingness to allow me to be involved.
questions for the commission? Board? That's a serious problem.
I'm glad everyone got here okay. That's almost today at least. We're almost all here in Martin. Talked to the board about some staffing changes and a couple losses I was sad about. More people, all that everything couple losses retired out. And I just want to check yeah, we'll be spending a ton of time on this board every month. The other loss is another program manager. You may recall for a lot of while. She actually moved on to the mental health field. And while we often need mental health help at CWCB, she is doing that someplace else. And so we're proud of her for making that leap to something that she was really passionate about. I also wanted to take a minute to let you know as the board that every opportunity that we have with these openings, what's happening within the agency and how we've shifted and changed, we look at these openings as an opportunity to bring in staff or build up current staff that in a way that it really focuses on the agency's goals and missions, especially in line with the Colorado's water plan. So that being said, an example of that would be a position that some of what's happened. Colorado has been especially stakeholder driven. Chris Sturm will also say it when he gets up and talks about this. That leverages 4 times that. Every state dollar is leverages an additional $4 of other funds coming in from local, state, and other resources. So that being said, when we look at a year like this year, that 2.3 million was prior to the grants that you'll hear today. And so to look at the growth of that program and the impact that it's had is huge. So I want you to keep an eye on that as you hear this today. Another thing that I wanted to call the board's attention to and urge you to attend is the instrumental workshop, which is held as part of Colorado Water Congress on the workshop day, January 24th, where state and federal agencies and other interested persons can come in and they have the opportunity to make recommendations. And the CWCB really leads in that and works with the Water Trust, and there's a lot of data and information and advocating, but it's an important piece of our program at CWCB, and we take this That being said, the last thing I wanted to say is the executive director us use him as a mentor. He was a close and personal mentor of mine. If you worked in consulting at any point in time, if you worked at Jerry County, a couple years ago, a few of us took our vacation time and spent a few days learning about the Platte River and in a large group of Jerry County. And so I wanted to give a shout out to him at a special time, but I wanted us to stay and to pull people. Move forward with ideas that have been discussed and debated for years. So this is a great loss. While he finished his career in Nebraska, much of his career was spent in Colorado. And created much of what we have on that Platte River program. So it's been a sad weekend.
Of the CWCB. So I just wanted to close with that. Thank you.
Question for Director Mitchell. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Kevin Ray.
I do want to say one thing right at the start. You mentioned Suzanne Sellers. I bet you really experienced a similar loss with Suzanne several years ago when she was a very solid king in our office and skills and abilities that obviously it's hard for you to hold on to her the way it was for us to hold on to her, but she's a personal friend too, and so I'll miss her just from being a part of the state. I did want to mention something else on the SMART Act, and I haven't planned to, but after Director Brown's comments, I wanted to say one thing, and I almost lost my nerve when I saw the budget director come in earlier, but I will mention that that was my first time to testify at the SMART Act. And Bill Levine does a good job of introducing presenters, and he introduced me as something of a no-nonsense person. And something as I was coming after Director Mitchell, and I think that was a nice way of saying I could be a little boring if I needed me. But to Director Brown's comments, I did not give the committee any reason to use their kind of ideas on me, and that was success for me. So maybe it's a little bit for the Department of Mind. Bring up speed on a couple things going on. I've talked in the past, and I'm sure Dick Wolf did in his role, talked about rulemaking in the Republican River Basin. And as you all know, we do have a situation out there where there's a perceived inequity between many of the parties, those that fall into the Water Conservation District boundary and those that don't. And there is still the possibility of rulemaking, there's the possibility of legislation to modify boundaries and bring them to sync with what's going on hydrogeologically out there. We have had some discussion, Mike Sullivan and I, Mike Sullivan, my deputy director, more than once working with the parties to describe how enforcement can work. And
compact works.
if there is a potential for legislation to recognize much of this, we would, of course, continue to be happy to inform those people out there how that would work and how that would maybe help things as far as our administration. So we're standing by on that. It's something obviously that needs to break fairly soon. To that situation. As Dr. Dunn knows, that next Monday start the rulemaking trial and Division 3 for the groundwater and the bridge rules. And relevant to that, I would just like to say that the staff of DWR has just worked so hard in the last months, 6 to 8 to 12 months, working with parties, getting stipulated settlements to satisfy their concerns, so that will limit the amount of time spent in trial and all these many parties. And I believe that it's been very effective. We've been able to do it just because we have that expertise and people were together. We still, of course, have parties in the trial. We'll still have to continue with that. But it looks much better. It looks much more efficient and our ability to get through trial because of that work by people. I wanted to say that in recent years, we've spent a fair amount of time, primarily Dick Wolf and I, going out and talking to people in the state about the use of topic. And as that continued on, use or lose it necessarily included the discussion of waste, and that term is used in the statute in our rights. That's an important one to Director Wattenberg and I talked about it, and how we administer that. I thought that we had kind of wound down and we informed people, but I got a call from the Colorado Water Alliance, and they invited me, and this was a few months ago when they invited me to come down to Vegas at the end of January, or I guess just next week. And of course, I'm invited to Southwest Colorado. I don't have the details, but they say I'll be there because that's a good excuse to go down there, and then we'll work out the details later. But it is a couple days of workshops where we'll talk in further detail again about water administration law and how to use or lose it, plays into that, and how that necessarily implicates the discussion of waste. That conversation is going on, we're happy now because people just don't really know all those intricacies and outs of changes in water rights and the absolute and traditional water rights and all those things that affect the way they get to use their water and how that affects the value of the water right. Happy to continue that conversation in Southwest Colorado and any of your other basements too. Happy to do that. Similarly, we've had a lot of discussion in past years. We had a bill that DNR was strongly in favor of, or strongly promoting last year on historical conceptive use calculations and the methodologies that we use just to do that certain things of water rights case. And of course, we all know as engineers how to, down to the 10th decimal place, calculate things that we're not necessarily too sure about with a lot of precision. And one of the things that has been happening to water users is in a case where they may want to consider a change of water right for a short-term need, that sort of precision can be costly and really difficult. And they would like to find a different way. Unfortunately, this House Bill 12 last year did not find its way into that, and we have been able to consider that, but I'm really heartened to see that the engineering community still wants to have that conversation, even though they're a little concerned about House Bill 12. And I've been approached, I've had the discussions about things that can be done for all of us to get on the same page about the way that engineering works. And again, I suppose I'll be doing this for a long time, and it's continuing that sort of rapport that Dick Wolf as the leader of our agency had with a lot of users out there in the engineering community, and I've been fortunate enough to continue that rapport with our consulting engineers out there and continue that discussion with them. Two rulemakings in our water supply group, as you recall, House Bill 1228, which is the Ag Water Protection Water Right Bill. And I think I've got one or two times those words in the right order. The Ag Water Protection Water Right Bill. We did file those rules in the water court, as I told you before. Those two cases in Water Divisions 1 and 2 will be consolidated in Water Division 1. And we'll work through that and try to get those rules online very soon in 2018 so that people can take advantage of that legislation from 2016. The second one, last year in the 2017 legislative session, we saw a bill that encourages the storage of water and land extraction in non-tributary aquifers around the state. We've been able to weave the rulemaking associated with that bill, with that legislation, into the existing rules for extraction of water from Denver Basin non-tributary aquifers. We put those rules out there in Formally, we have United States law meetings and we'll file those with the Secretary of State very soon in order to get that in. And again, that gives more options to water users around the state to identify that aquifer, make a determination that it is non-tributary, meets the statutory definition of non-tributary, and then be able to inject water into it for later extraction with what I would call relatively liberal rules or guidance on when and where that can be taken out. Very much different from the difficulties that come from storing water in a tributary aquifer and then later extracting it.
I want to say that tomorrow we have, Wednesday morning with Water Congress starts. A great speaker every year in the Water Congress workshop. The director, Judge Decker, has always asked the state engineer's office to spend a little time updating people, and then we go through our, we have our vision, reach those water administration in there. Division, and you know, we all have the same Colorado water law, we have the same constitutional case law. We have 7 different climates and 7 different water users and water users. And so
Nationally recognized as a premier dam safety program in the country, and that's led by that program is led by Bill McCormick. But you'll recall maybe it was 10 or 11 months ago when we were hearing about the dam failure, the spillway failure, we were Mill Dam in California, and that made really cool news, and that was brought to us when people started asking. Very much to the news agencies that they really couldn't, and here's why. There was an independent forensic team report on that failure.
and the outcome of that report was recently released. And I wanted to just read, I really hate to read verbatim, it's kind of long, but I wanted you to hear something that report brought out. The lesson regarding physical inspection is pertinent not only to the parties involved in the United States Dam Safety Act. The overwhelming majority of dams in the United States are regulated by state dam safety organizations, such as Colorado and New Mexico, where it's allowed to be used out to regular activities. Consider the programs on physical inspection what to be identified through the inspection. Periodically filed reviews and failure modes evaluation safety programs will likely require both additional resources and reallocation of available resources. However, without such change, we design ourselves to continue to further incidents such as happened at Oregon and February 2017. Which are likely to be acceptable and over regulated in place. Typically called out Colorado and for having that. Except that they did say it would require additional resources to continue. Last quick comment, Director Brown mentioned his work on the public deliberation issues. And I just want to mention that my work on that in the last 7 months. Our work with the state together. It's such a nice what I can call Director Randall at 7 in the morning and I mean, after I had a conversation with Director Brown, Director Stoltz, Director Can, and speak with one voice at the end of that call, Director Mitchell. So, those are what, if we're doing the thing that when it comes to working through the issues, And of course, when we're presenting our issues to the other states, we still recognize could be there with us.
So, well, we have the experience and knowledge of the sold and record. Thank you both. That's my report. It gives us a lot of outlines. With that, let's move to Colorado Virtual Live Director Rochelle. Good morning. Thank you very much. It's good to see you again. It's been a few board meetings that I missed due to other conflicts. So I want to start off this morning to talk about how CW and CWCB are working on activities together. But I think one that's coming up here that's of particular importance is our water and aquatic staff are working with CWCB and CDPHE a couple of weeks to talk about the water plan task of developing common metrics for assessing health and resiliency of Colorado watershed and rivers. And certainly we're glad to be at the table with those other two fine agencies. So the other things that we're working on, within the agency is not just, I think there probably could be a perception there that the water plan is, and that's your plan, and you're responsible for delivering a lot of those tasks and metrics in there. Well, at Barcelona, we went through a strategic planning process as well as operationalizing what those key strategies are. So basically putting bodies and money to those key metrics. And so we've taken the water plan to heart. We're going to be working on updating our metrics, of course, with CWCB to talk about in-stream flow and natural lake levels, water quality, but also how water quality decisions are water quality data and information is made during the Clean Water Act decision processes, so aquatic life and others can benefit. But also to talk about improving water for habitation and recreation through the administration of our water rights. And I think with our strategic plan and operationalizing these, I think it quickly becomes apparent is we can't do this either. And this is really obvious to, I think, a lot of you have been in this sort of approach for a long time, but we need each other. And if we can work better together to have common metrics and common goals, and I think the discussion, I think our approach, I think our tactics become much better aligned as we go down the road. So we're really going to put some hard measures and metrics to those items. So and we just really
Relationship we have CWCB, the water resources that help us to deliver our mission to our constituents. Real quick, that we're working on is we have been working on it for a very long time. We have, as you know, the reintroduction within the state a number of years ago. The service and many of the state agencies are within the range. They call it species assessment every 5 years. This one came out with the recommendation to be because of the incredible response of the population, states how they've been managing and monitoring that species. So that's a totally different process, because the SSA is information that does complete that process. So lifting of the links will be a huge success story for all of them in Colorado, but also the Western United States. If you remember, that species was marketed line about 40 years ago. So we implemented this year, this coming season, mandatory CWD testing. There were some areas of the state that we have been awarded at least a bad indication of chronic wasting disease. We are getting those results, and they're not good.
February is going to lay out this plan for how we're going to continue to manage this. Director George was at the front of this a long, long time ago, still is. This disease, but what we're seeing in a variety of other states, particularly the north, is 1 and 2. They're becoming wasting disease in some areas. Less than that. Just to reinstitute and re-engage the public, the landowners, and others about how we're going to continue to manage chronic wasting disease. It's our whole goal is to reduce in that herd. We also, Parks and Wildlife also sent a letter.
Our letter to the cooperator in the Bear Creek reservoir expansion project. We continue that part. The commission last month, for several months, has been debating how to shed animals. Put around who may or may not know unique business and stuff. Brought it to that shed animals off of private and public land. And when I'm talking to person hiking on the trail with the dog and see antlers and takes it. There are some folks that have made a significant business out of it. Our officers and also county and city has been contemplating how to deal with this. We're not the only state. Certainly.
So for the last 3 or 4 months, the commission and staff and others, we've been talking with parties, and of course, they're on all sides of this issue. Had a choice to and institute a regulation that would license, then allow us to enforce this activity. The commission last month fell short of a regulation to license this activity, but left the door open for continuing that discussion. So what we're seeing right now is that from January 1 to April 30th, shed antler collection is closed west of I-25. And so in other words, May 1 will open that date except for the Gunnison Basin. Gunnison Basin has special rules and regulations they've been working on very hard to extend that to May 15th. And that's for Gunnison sage grouse protection. So I don't think we're done with shed antlers. This is certainly an issue that is growing in complexity, but we're going to continue to take that on and show some leadership in the West of what we do. Director Randall mentioned this morning, we're running we're calling our Future Generations license fee bill this year. It's currently being drafted, and so I haven't seen the final what's what, but we're working with members of the legislature to clone that. This is going to be a significant year. It's going to be a very complicated year as far as looking at raising license fees. In general, license fees for resident hunters and anglers, as well as some of the non-resident anglers. So we're going to continue to track that bill. We should see this thing probably introduced sometime at the end of the month. And we're just getting out there talking about what the information is and what we're looking at in this bill. But it's, in a nutshell, is a very stripped down version of what we were looking for last year. The other good news is we finally launched and went live with our integrated Parks and Wildlife system. This is our collection system for fees, permits, passes, and other things. People like, this is 6 years over to try to get a new system together that brings in our old systems of how we've done things, and certainly marks a very important point and deliverable as far as the merger of Parks and Wildlife goes. We have one system for our customers to go on, buy park passes, set camping reservations, or buy a hunting or fishing license all in one shot. If you haven't had a chance, get on there and check it out. If you buy a hunting or fishing license here soon or a park pass, you're going to need to get on and create an account. But I think what the power of this system is not just allowing folks to go to a one-stop shop. It's going to allow us to start to harness who our customers are and the data that comes with that. So we're very excited about it. Also, with our fingers crossed, I think we're holding our breath a little bit to make sure that the system doesn't crash at some point, which is coming up with the spring turkey draw. So this is really going to be a test for it. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Brown mentioned about the Mexican wolf recovery plan. This has been a 2.5-year effort at least. Parks and Wildlife sending our folks down with the other 4 corner states and the federal and state governments of Mexico to talk about what we're going to do with the Mexican wolf. Real quick, it was litigation from both sides, the state of Arizona as well as some environmental organizations about the outdated recovery plan. And so that kicked in a new process. The short of it is the 4 governors of those states have sent a letter to the Secretary of Interior, Secretary George.
We hope this is done with the best available funds, and that the states are actively doing so. There is an increase in the recovery goals of Mexican wolves on the ground, primarily the south of our community. The interest and emphasis on our country of Mexico, and we also need the states of Mexico to expand Mexico down there. Some of the range down there, so we should focus down there. So we shouldn't see any Mexican wolves in southern Colorado, what we call border here anytime soon. Should be 40, so we're really happy with that. We're really happy with that. Jared, questions for Bob? Actually, I do have one. Back to the conservation needs. Is that the more that we learned about this? It's still very specific. This is sharing it is in out there as well. We haven't collected the numbers on how expansive health are, the health and can be positive to see the median are. So we're going to be monitoring that as well. I know the states are, but right now, primarily the viewer is all right, let's move to the Colorado Water Resources Power Development Authority. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Board of Members and Director General. I'm Mike Rose, the Colorado Water Resources and Power Development Authority. Of course, this morning I'll try to move this along. So, just a couple of things. The project eligibility list that I always talk about each and every year at this time. Just wanted to highlight the numbers. It's not scary. It's just to inform you
addition to what we've identified in the water plan. On the wastewater side, we've got $7.3 billion. On our side, we've got 361 projects for an estimated of $7.5 billion. On the joint resolution, I'm happy to say that that was introduced very quickly when the began, and actually without a committee hearing was adopted twice. I almost saw on the chair like saw that. So it is moved speedily through the Senate and will be moving over to the House. Since our fellow friends are out of work today, I guess, I can't speak too much to Monero of our federal capitalization grants to our PSRF programs. Fortunately, we do have some funding capability. We've got capacity to make one, so that shouldn't affect us immediately if we've got some time for them to get their act together. And as you know, we get our funding through the EPA's budget, so we need to get those. Just want to mention, I know there's been progress on the MSL Cloud project and recreation, so we'll keep our fingers crossed that continues to move forward. One thing they haven't made any progress on, as you all know, is final construction cost allocations. And with the deputy commissioner being in Denver, some recognition that we need to get that done and taken care of so we can move forward. I'm happy to report that Long Hollow, that you guys assisted with, has great storage this year. Of course, that's probably going to give the spring holes for us, but that was it didn't fill, but it stored a lot more water than I think any of us expected. So that was good news. It matters. As I mentioned, the joint resolutions through the Senate. The authority does have Senate Bill 19, which extends the loan terms that we can make under our clean water program. We already have the ability to do that under the drinking water program, and the federal act was amended to allow for loan terms up to 30 years. So we're doing a statutory amendment, 3795-101. If you guys are interested in looking that up, but making a couple of modifications, pretty simple. That is actually not through the Senate Committee last Thursday. About 21, the State Affairs Committee of the Water Congress supports the bill. You have to express your support for that bill. We would appreciate it. You guys have, for a very long time, we've long terms out for 30 years. So that I'll stop and Mr. Chairman.
Questions from what? No, thanks, Doctor. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Agenda item number 5. This time, let's move to agenda item number 6, financial management. Morning.
Morning, board. It's good to see you. Kevin, you gave a nice introduction and talked about how I said you were very straightforward, and I have to say that although I hate being straightforward, I was given about 20-25 minutes for this presentation, so I'm going to be very straightforward today.
This is Bill Levine. I'm the budget director here for the Department of Resources. And I have with me my staff, Carly Jacobs, who I would like to believe is the future of severance tax here at TNR. It is a tough title to hang on so we'll see if she sticks around. So we're here today to talk to you about severance tax. We put a little photo here that kind of summarizes what we're going to say, which is basically that it's been a wild ride and we're not sure where it's going. It might be a dangerous place that we are currently in. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Carly to start with a little bit of severance tax 101.
Thank you. I'm Carly Jacobs. I'm a budget analyst and apparently the future of severance tax. Nice to meet you. I'll be speaking with you today. If at any point you start to feel like you resemble our friends in a roller coaster on the first leg, just put your arms up. It makes it a whole lot more exciting. We've been doing that since about the middle of November. Anybody who works with severance tax. So I'm going to start with just a quick refresher about the severance tax, how it's distributed, and some of the factors that we see influencing the patterns in the revenue stream. I'll pass it back over to Bill to give the doom and gloom part of the presentation on current revenue, and then we'll look at you to talk about the two funds that DNR has that receive severance tax, the severance tax operational fund and the perpetual base fund. The tax on, thanks Andrew, non-renewable minerals as they are severed from the earth, so severance tax. Molybdenum, metallic metals, but most of all oil and gas, so about 90 to 95% of severance tax revenue comes from oil and gas. That chart at the bottom, which you can see a little better off to your right, shows the distribution of severance tax, which is made according to a formula in statute. Severance tax revenue is first split 50-50 between the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Local Affairs. Within DNR, that money is then split in half again, so half goes to the operational fund, half goes to the perpetual base fund. Now there are a couple of things when you think about severance tax that you can absolutely always rely on to be true, and that is that it is absolutely guaranteed to be totally unpredictable and volatile. And you can see this in a couple of different places when you look at severance tax revenue over time. When you compare it with other revenue streams that are highly dependent on oil and gas, and when you look at the revenue forecasts that we get compared to the actual revenue that we end up with, and I'll just show you a couple quick pictures to illustrate this. The severance tax revenue over time, and when you look at this chart, you're going to notice two things. One is that there is huge variability in general over time. So you can see we go from a high of 319 million way down to a negative amount in the most recent fiscal year. Had we not had general fund, we actually would have had negative revenue. So 319 million to -7 is just a huge stretch in general. You can also see that we have considerable year-over-year variability. So there are a couple instances along there where severance tax doubles, and then the year after, you'll notice a huge drop. So revenue can change drastically from one year to the next. And just to illustrate this volatility in comparison to other severance tax revenues, or other oil and gas related revenues, this is just your severance tax revenue again in line form. And you'll see that in any given year, the variability averages 82%. So that means that in one direction or another, severance tax revenue on average changes by 82%. So a substantial amount of volatility. The red line is federal mineral lease revenue, also heavily dependent on oil and gas. That variability is about 28%, so significantly less. You can see just the range bouncing around is much less than severance tax. And then if you'll indulge me and look at the very bottom of that graph, there's a wee little green line that runs across the bottom. That's the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission mill levy, which only fluctuates about, on average, 13% in a year. So you can see that severance tax is really unusually volatile compared to revenue streams that are dependent on oil and gas. So much so that it's very, very, very hard to forecast. So these blue bars represent the December forecasts that we get from legislative council staff. That means that 6 months of the fiscal year have already passed, and these are their predictions for the revenue that we'll end up with in total for the year. On average, they missed by 20% one way or the other. So even though they've already had 6 months, this is a mid-year projection, they're off by about 20%, rule of thumb on average. Now they can be off by more. That 20% sort of disguises larger variability. It's been off by 40%, it's been off by 60%, but rule of thumb about 20% in any given year for the forecast. Now, that's, I don't want to say normal, but that's a normal level of error in the forecast. If you have a single disruptive event, like the BP America case that we'll talk about in a minute, that forecast can be off by much, much more. So what's driving this variability? The first is fluctuations in oil and gas. Right? Price and production changes drive changes in revenue, but we know that when you compare it with other oil and gas related revenue streams, that can only account for so much. The second factor is unique disturbance tax, and that is the property tax offset. You'll often hear that referred to as the ad valorem credit. Operators can take 87.5% of their property taxes as a credit against their state sales tax liability. Taxes are calculated. That leads to a 1 or 2 year lag between when you earn the credit and when your credit's applied. So that basically drives higher highs and lower lows. If you have a high offset against a low revenue year, you offset most of your sales tax, and that's very low revenue. Other way around, if you have a low offset against a high sales tax year, so it's extra high.
Or the long bill is set. And so as we were looking at our budget for this year, the forecast was we would have about $143 million of severance tax revenue flow through the allocation formula. And as Carly said to you, 50% of that number would come to DNR, and then the DNR portion would be split into equal pieces. Half of our half, or 25% of that total $143 million, would go to the perpetual base fund, and another 25% of that number would go into the operational fund. So that $143 million, as the summer evolved, actually grew to $147 million, then to $150 million. Okay, so just to sort of set up what the economists were telling us to expect from this revenue stream. Now, on the top portion of this slide, we show you what actually came in. And so an important part here, and some of you may have sort of wondered when Carly talked about this negative $7 million revenue year, well, how can you have negative revenue? Hopefully this chart will help explain that. And that's that we talk a lot about net collections, and net collections are the raw tax collections we have from severance tax minus the refunds that we make. And so you'll notice that we had negative months several times so far this year. So we started with a small number in July in net collections, and then we immediately had a very large negative amount of revenue in August because we had quite a few refunds. And then again in October, we again had refunds unfortunately exceed collections. So it's been a very up and down year. It seems the rough pattern there. In fact, the exact pattern is that every other month is negative, every other month is positive. I don't think that's a pattern that would be overly predictive of the future, but I think the pattern of it's all over the place is absolutely predictive of the future. But you can see that net collections 6 months into the year are 17.5 million. And so if you do some very simple math, we could double that and say, well, that we're on pace to achieve about $35 million of revenue this year. So again, put that in perspective of the 3 forecasts we had leading up to where we are. 35 million is a lot less than we were forecasting. So we were watching these trends of revenue coming in every other month negative. And then in mid-November, we got a memo from the Department of Revenue telling us that there were still quite a few BP refunds expected to be paid over the next 18 months. And this was a surprise to us because the Department of Revenue, way back when the BP case broke, said there's so many millions of dollars at stake. We expect over the next 12 months, and that would have been through the end of last fiscal year, we expect over those 12 months that all the companies will come in and claim those millions of dollars of refunds that they're owed. And that projection turned out to not be a good projection. Again, the companies were actually very slow to come in and claim their refunds. And so we still have, as of November 1, we had $72.5 million worth of refunds still hanging over the state. And so those will still, unfortunately, decrease revenue over those 18 months as we net out those refunds against the revenue that comes in. So I told you that we were projecting, and they were fairly similar. I tend to round them off and just say we were projecting about $150 million a year fairly consistently up through September 2017. Well, they forecast every 3 months, and so in December they released their new forecast, and we were certainly asking a lot of questions of the economists at DNR. And I think everyone's eyes sort of trained to those numbers where the revenue just wasn't coming in the way they were forecasting. So the forecasts came down quite a bit. And so I compare in these 2 columns, which was just the most recent one prior to December, and then I give you December. And the trend here is that all of the forecasts for all of the years all went down by approximately $100 million. At least for the current year, that's about a 2/3 reduction that they made in a 3-month period. So a very dramatic reduction in the forecast. Just to throw this out there, I also put in, there's one other forecast that's out there. So I've been giving you all legislative council numbers, and those are the ones by law that we use in certain cases. But the governor's staff also does forecasts. I think there are 2 interesting things here. The differences seem fairly large, and indeed, they're certainly not small. One of the takeaways for me is that we are in a time of higher uncertainty. So some of you who have been on the board a while have heard me say before that this is a very volatile, unpredictable revenue stream. You heard Carly say it earlier today. We've been saying it for years. I would say that we're now in a period of higher uncertainty because of the BP case and not knowing exactly how much the revenue stream has shrunk. And so I'm not surprised to see that the 2 sets of economists who forecast the revenue are actually not so much on the same page, because I think there's just a higher amount of uncertainty very specifically about what we are now taxing. What is this revenue stream? What's left after we're now allowing deductions we did not allow prior to that BP case? And what we don't know, again, the economists seem to be showing now that the revenue stream is permanently smaller. We don't know how much smaller, but I think it's very clear that it is a smaller revenue stream. So OSPB's forecast, like I said, with that number here, is about 25% higher than the Legislative Council forecast. And again, kind of getting into that uncertainty. So how much has it shrunk? I truly don't believe anyone in the state knows the answer to that question. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carly to talk about where we now stand with the operational fund specifically.
So the operational fund is one of those 2 funds that we were talking about that DNR has that receives severance tax. And it's divided into 2 tiers of programs. So you may have heard of Tier 1 programs and Tier 2 programs. Tier 1 programs are first priority funding. They tend to support staff, ongoing operations, and another handful of programs within the department. And Tier 2 money is conditional funding for programs that are supposed to be more flexible in the face of volatility. These are your grant programs and your construction projects. Those are funded if revenue is available. idea of the scale of tier 1 and tier 2, tier 1 appropriations are about 17.1 million, and of those CWCB has an appropriation of 1.3 million. There's also some tier 2 programs that I know that you're interested in: the Water Supply Reserve Fund, Species Conservation, the Interbasin Compacts, and Water Efficiency Grant programs all get funding out of that. There's a few more that aren't on the slide. Aquatic nuisance species comes to mind, but that's sort of what lives in tier 2. In terms of the outlook for the fund, the first most important thing is that we may not have enough money to fund tier 1 in the current year. So our tier 1 programs, staff and operating, are possibly in jeopardy. Now I apologize for the number soup, but if you look at the yellow row, that would be our tier 1 shortfall under a number of different scenarios. So this first scenario to the far left is if we had no other money come into the fund this year, if all we had was the money that we have in hand right now, we would be short by about $3.4 million in funding those tier 1 programs. The two columns on the right are the forecasts. Based on the forecast that Bill was talking about, you can see that those look a little bit better because they are predicting a little bit more money coming in than what we actually have in hand. The margin is narrow, more or less narrow, but generally still pretty narrow for tier 1 programs. But there's one more factor that we haven't talked about yet, and that is that there's a statutory transfer that was set up by Senate Bill 17260 that transfers severance tax to the general fund. The operational funds portion of that, 25% of that, is $11.4 million. And if you look at the bottom row, the bottom line, we go negative no matter what scenario you look at if that transfer occurs. So the operational fund is not in great shape, barring a legislative change maybe going forward. Second piece is that there's no funding for tier 2. So if we can't fund tier 1, we really, really can't fund tier 2. So we don't expect tier 2 funding through probably the end of fiscal year 20, at least. That's as far as our model goes out. But it's possible that it's unfunded on a more permanent basis. So you heard us talk a little bit about how revenue is probably permanently reduced due to the BP changes. It's possible that tier 2 may be unfunded in the long term. So that's something that we're looking at pretty carefully. And just to give you an idea of the scope of sort of what we would need to start funding tier 2, in order for any dollar to go to tier 2, with some assumptions, we need roughly $34 million in the fund to cover tier 1 and the tier 1 reserve. If we think that the operational fund gets 25% of severance tax revenue, we need to have a revenue year in the neighborhood of 136 million. So back of the envelope kind of stuff, but to give you an idea of the kind of revenue we would need to start funding tier 2, we're not really looking at funding at that level anytime in the near future. You might be on your own with arrows.
All right, so I'm going to close this out, and then we'll turn to you for any questions that you have. But I'm going to look at the perpetual base fund. And see where are we? I guess we're having a little bit of problems with our. Oh, cool. Thank you, Carly. So under the current LCS forecast, about $14.4 million would be deposited into the perpetual base fund in the current fiscal year. Under the OSBB forecast, that amount would be a little bit less. So OSBB had a lower forecast for this year. The amount that would flow into the fund would be about $9 million. And again, we're trending currently below both forecasts. $1 million has actually been deposited into the fund through the first 6 months of the year. Just like Carly talked about with the operational fund, there is a second $11.4 million transfer that will occur not from the operational fund, but from the perpetual base fund. And the idea of putting that into law was that the severance tax revenue stream was going to help with the state's general fund budget and in essence repay for some of the assistance the general fund provided in fiscal year 16-17. Well, unfortunately, when you add the relatively small amount of money that's going to come in and then deduct $11.4 million, the potential range of money that will flow into the perpetual base fund, and this is my last bullet point, ranges from about plus $3 million to as low as a minus $7 million, depending on whether or not more revenue flows in this year and how much more flows in. And again, my middle bullet point there is something that I think I keep repeating, which is every other month it's positive, it's negative. The amounts don't show a whole lot of a predictable pattern. So we're just in a period of, unfortunately, very high uncertainty. So that is all I had to say about severance tax. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. I know we're trying to set up a discussion about both the projects bill and I think species, which will come a little bit later, but happy to share our thoughts with you or answer questions.
Director George.
So larger question then, Bill, what does the general fund look like in this distant horizon? That's a pretty good picture that severance tax isn't going to do what the things we need to do. Is the general fund long-range forecast any better than this so that we could imagine that we could successfully compete for some general fund money for our necessary backfill?
Maybe a few things about the general fund. So certainly the forecasts, when we talk about a 20% error, the forecasts for general fund are, I think, plus or minus a few percentage points at most. So our forecasting there and virtually all other places is very, very accurate. We're in a very interesting current time with our general fund forecasts in that when the U.S. Congress passed tax reform, they actually had an impact on state collections of general fund. So the U.S. Congress decided that they wanted to reduce the number of deductions that you can take. And in Colorado, we base state income tax on the federal base. And so everyone's federal base, not everyone, most people's federal base should have gone up because you have less deductions. And that means that your state went up. Everyone will pay more taxes to the state under the federal tax reform. So the estimate is that general fund revenue in the state of Colorado will go up by something like $200 to $300 million across all years. And that was, in essence, an unexpected windfall to the state of Colorado. And that certainly creates an opportunity to potentially look at general fund as one of the solutions here. But that's still something we're working through, but definitely does create an opportunity there.
Director Randall.
Not the good kind of chills. Get it, the bad kind. No, I really just want to share that. Again, I think Bill and Carly in particular have done a really good job explaining this to decision makers, both in the Joint Budget Committee and in the governor's office. And there really is a recognition within both of those bodies that this is a problem. It's untenable in the short term, and it's really challenging in the longer term, as Director George pointed out. So, you know, we really are waiting to see what the January revenue numbers look like, the severance tax revenue numbers. For the month of January, those usually come a week or 10 days into the following month. So early February, we'll have we'll have a slightly clearer picture, you know, 1 month better picture of the 17-18 figures. But without, you know, nobody's committed to a particular course to solving this, but I can say that there is genuine recognition of the challenge and interest in finding a solution on this. So maybe I just share that to say we're in this together with a lot of people who recognize the importance of the programs that severance tax funds, both at the Department of Local Affairs, because that money touches every county in the state of Colorado, programs that severance tax.
Director Goebel, and then Director Hawkins.
Thanks for the very good presentation. Very helpful. I was just curious, is there a schedule or a deadline that these payments back to the oil and gas companies have to be made by?
There is a timeline, which is nice, right? There's a sort of a certain discrete period of time. It has to do with the statute of limitations of the case. So I think there's 3 years of amended returns that they can file. So once we sort of get out of that window, we'll know that there's no more refunds. Unfortunately, until then, we don't really have any control over when the oil and gas companies decide to file those amended returns. So if they all were really on the ball and filed them tomorrow, we would be in big trouble, but that it wouldn't be spread out over time. So it's the timing issue within that window is a little tough, but once we sort of roll past that, then we'll just be at that forward-looking kind of phase of revenue.
Director Hawkins.
How much information, sorry. How much information do we have about the potential magnitude of the permanent lowering of severance tax?
Size, because the answer to that question is not much. You know, we've heard a range of estimates from economists. I think 12% was floating around, but really it's not wise to take any of those as a concrete thing to rely on. It's one of those things that we kind of have to wait it out and wait and see. So unfortunately, we would love to give you more information, but we don't really have a good estimate for that at the moment.
Other questions? I guess I have one, and this is kind of follows Director Randall and Director George's. The water plan, I think some of us, probably all of us, envisioned that at some point in time we get on the same playing field as what prisons and everything else is. Are we there yet? And I guess this is kind of a broad question that people that are in the know, can we take this to the legislature and or the governor and say, we're right there with everybody else? Or do we need more homework?
Thank you. So, and by that, do you mean be sort of at the table with the fundamental general funded programs? So I think that's tough to say. I mean, I think the general fund is, there are some significant draws on the general fund that you can count on one hand, and it's corrections, it's K-12 education, it's Medicaid, it's, you know, and those are really fixed costs. And so because of the constraints of Tabor, the general fund isn't growing, and so there isn't much extra to go around, is maybe the, you know, maybe is maybe the way to say it. And so, you know, I think the water plan and I think this board has done a really good job explaining the need to address long-term needs today and to begin doing that. I think the board did so with its 3-year funding plan of $25 million a year to implement the water plan starting last year. The challenge is the revenue isn't there to support it. So, you know, without kind of handicapping our chances of sitting at the general fund table as full members, you know, I think that's going to be really a real challenge, but I think there might be opportunities in the short term to help us out of this, out of the quandary that we're in, again, just to fund the essentials of what government does and people have come to expect from severance tax.
Randall.
No.
Oh.
I was just going to say.
Hang on while I get this all straightened out. Okay. Any further questions from Bill? Go ahead, please.
So just a quick comment, sort of in response to what you were asking. I know, looking at, I think, the very long-term financial needs of the CWCB, I think there was an assumption that you had a revenue stream from all the revenue streams, only 100 million, and that to get to where you wanted to go, you probably needed about another 100 million. I think part of what we're telling you here is it's not clear that you really have revenue streams that equal 100 million anymore. And so that your long-term funding needs of 100 million might need to be relooked at. It might really be 120 million, 130 million. And not that we know the answer to that today, and not that a lot of studying will get us the answer tomorrow in a that short a time frame. But I think that some things are shifting, and the needs of the agency may shift with them.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Carly. Any further? I think we've got it. Again, thanks. At this point in time, let's take a quick break, and then we will continue on with 6B. Let's be back here at 10:25.
Test. All right, Kirk Russell, Finance Section Chief, and I think the first thing I want to do is thank Bill and Carly. I think we should make it a point, we should invite them back to speak to the board when they have good news. It seems like they're always here when we're talking about the bad news. It's also an interesting interesting image when you talk about a roller coaster ride with this severance tax, and the thought that there are those that sit on the roller coaster and raise their arms as they go down the steep slide. I am not one of those. I probably grip it as hard as I can, and that's partly because I know that it was built by the lowest bidder, and I'm familiar with probably some of the engineers that were involved in that process as well. But regardless, what I'd like to do is talk about the good news related to the board's position relative to severance tax. And it's primarily wrapped around the fact that the CWCB receives this revenue. We put it into that perpetual base account and turn it into a steady revenue stream, which is just an outstanding model for something that is so volatile. So the first chart that I want to look at is one that looks very similar to the chart that Bill and Carly were showing you. I take their information, I work with them regularly to determine what this looks like for CWCB. And I'm going all the way back to 2000. The left-hand side is millions of dollars. And the CWCB into the perpetual base account, as they indicated, we received 25% of that annual revenue. And when you deal with the forecast of severance tax, we watch it. We a lot of times will just use it somewhat as a gauge what we might see into the future. These are hard numbers from the past, and then the estimated 2018, 2019, and for us that's fiscal year, and we're in 2018 right now, fiscal year 2018. And so I typically look at the green line, and over the last since the 2009, 2010 as a starting point for severance tax revenue, and that's right in this area, 2009. And I project that we see about $40 million annually coming from severance tax. And I just use that as a marker to see what we have going forward. And unfortunately, let me hit this. Go ahead and hit the button, Andrew. Here. So you can see I had some animation there. The last two bars there, we were projected to receive about $40 million when I spoke to you in September. That was the forecast. Got back to the office in November, and a lot of this, the storyline was it's really bad. And so not only was it not $40 million, as Bill indicated, we are assuming it could be anywhere from -7 to +3 million dollars. And then I've got 11 million that has to be refunded to the general fund. So I went from this $40 million estimate down to close to a -10 to -15 million dollars. And it's that massive swing in the current fiscal year that has caused a lot of the turmoil related to the projects bill in this upcoming session. A lot of times, and this was an enormous swing for us, usually we see it swing, 20, 50%. This one was 100% swing and some. And what that has caused us to do is rethink not only this average is probably not 40 million anymore, it's probably closer to 32 to 35 million is what we need to use in some long-term projections. But the difficulty for us is to, many times we would say, well, there's always next year. And we'll kind of kick the can down the road and maybe make this adjustment because we've got time on our side here. But this last bar, again, forecasts in severance tax are so difficult, but the revenue was also another 40 million for this next year when I spoke in September and November. Now that's down around 10 million. So it's not like we're going to catch up in the near future with severance tax revenue. Okay, with that, I want to jump into the CWCB accounts. And while Andrew's pulling that up on the screen, I want to have you focus on the handout that I have for construction fund. We'll talk construction fund first, and then we'll jump into severance tax.
Kirk, are you going to come back? You've kind of left us here at our current hand-wringing episode. Back and talk again about past hand-wringing and what our policy changes should be, since you're already acknowledging the average is down by whatever that percent is, be from 40 to 32. And the next year is harder and harder to predict. Oh, our obligation here is to imagine, is this more than temporary hand-wringing, and therefore we should be changing our long-term policy? So I'm just asking if this is premature to have that conversation. You'll do it later.
I think I would like to remind me of that question in a little bit. I'm going to show you the long-term model that we use and how that question may affect that. So sorry, Andrew, if you'll go back to the PDF. Okay, the reminder, the two funds that we work with, the construction fund and the severance tax perpetual base fund. Construction fund is the first one I want to start with and remind, and we'll just stay on the projection side. I will share with the board that the cash flow is pretty normal this time of year. We're halfway through the fiscal year. Borrowers are in repayment. Revenues coming in from federal mineral lease. And the board has approved about $20 million out of the construction fund. All this seems pretty routine on the revenue side, the current revenue side. Let's stick with the projections column. We start off with about $17 million on line 2. We've got about 22 million that has come in over the course of this. I'm sorry, this is a projection. So we anticipate about $22 million to come in from repayment, loan repayment, some treasury interest. Line item number 4 is the federal mineral lease projection. That seems to be pretty steady at about $8 to $9 million. Severance tax transfer. I usually don't show this, but because of this discussion we'll have on severance tax, the statute currently transfers $10 million from severance tax to the construction fund. We set that up as $5 million a couple years ago. Last year we changed it to $10 million. That will be an automatic transfer every year, and that is anticipated for spending for water plan implementation. If for some reason the board chooses to use it for something else, it is still an automatic transfer. It moves from severance tax to the construction fund. There is an assumption, Director George, that there will be at least 10 million available for that transfer. We will always make sure that that's the case and understand that that's a cash transfer. Even if revenue is below for that particular year, it will be based on the cash that's available in the account to transfer over. And then that line number 6 is just a normal routine estimate on our part. We have a lot of loans that pay in full. And so on average, we have about $3 to $5 million in additional revenue that comes in that's unexpected. We also substantially complete our projects at random times. We really can't predict exactly when all of our projects close out. And when they do close out, we get an interest earning check from the money that was earned from interest during the construction phase. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in that number. It could be anywhere from probably 2 to 5 million in any particular year. But halfway through the year, we think there could be another 2 to 3 million coming in. Moving down that column, I am indicating that we won't take any more loans out of construction fund, the zeros on line 13 and 14. And then when I get down to operations, programs, and projects down below line number 17, our operations are about 8 million for this current fiscal year. I use an estimate on our automatic refreshes. In the statute, it says that the board has $1.8 million for, I think there's 3 or 4 items. One in particular that we talk about routinely is there's $1 million available for acquisitions for in-stream flow. We don't typically spend all 1.8 million. A lot of times it's about $1 million. And so I've estimated that at $1 million. The water plant funding, which we'll talk more in the next agenda item, but as a placeholder, we are recommending that $11 million be used for water plant implementation funding this fiscal year, or next fiscal year. The Republican River Matters, $8 million that was approved by the board at the last meeting. And then the non-reimbursable investments that the board approved in September. And we've got a couple additional non-reimbursable items that we would like to recommend to the board again at the next agenda item, leaving us about 10 million at the end of the year. And I feel pretty confident in that number. We'll line up pretty well with that. So I will stop there. If there are any questions on this particular sheet, the construction fund.
Questions for Kirk. Dr. Stolp.
Help me on the replenishables, the refreshes. Is that ag water for drought, $1 million fund? Is that included in there?
When we talk about severance tax, I'll hit that line. That comes out of the severance tax perpetual base account. There's $1 million available.
It's not in this.
Correct.
Okay.
That'll be on the next sheet.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Please continue.
Okay, the severance tax perpetual base fund. Again, we'll stay on the projection side. I don't see any significant issues out of the current cash flow side of this sheet. We start the year off with about $37 million. We usually see about 15 to 20 million coming in from loans and repayment. As you can imagine, when loans do close out, there's a jump in those annual payments. As an example, when Northern Water completes their 90 million project, we'll have a significant annual check that comes in. So these numbers can move with that kind of project closeout. Line number 4, cash in from severance tax. That tracks with Bill Levine and Carly's message that it could be anywhere from +3 to -7. I have chosen 0. Best guess at this time. I don't feel comfortable being any higher than that, although it does look like there are some improvements in that balance of refund versus revenue coming in. But I think it's responsible at this time to assume 0. Then the transfer from the loan guarantee fund, and this as Director Mitchell indicated, done some hand-wringing trying to figure out how to make ends meet with this the swing in severance tax that you saw. And one place that we regret to have to look is that loan guarantee fund. We had excess revenue last year available. We loaded that $30 million into that fund, had great intentions. We did not have any interest in it. And we felt like that was probably the easiest opportunity to use that. That was put in there primarily to help those that could go to the private market with pooled financing and hopefully reduce their interest rate in that process. So we felt like if they could go to the market for financing, this was kind of a secondary use of that funds. And we felt like now is the time to use that 30 million for the things we need to do. And then line number 6 is another estimate on reversals. You can see under the loans that the board has approved, currently you've approved about $50 million. So we have done a significant amount of loans for this fiscal year already. We're up around $70 million. I am proposing to maintain about $8 million for the next 2 board meetings, which is line 13 and 14. And then we start over again after July and July's board meeting. So we're getting close to where the unreserved number, and I've talked to Anna about what it looks like in her marketing list of projects that might be coming in, and she says that's pretty tight. There could be a pretty healthy run here yet before the year is up. And I think a lot of it has to do with the water plan implementation, the momentum this board has made with the water plan, but also it doesn't hurt that the interest rates are just ridiculously low, and maybe a concern that that could turn around. But business has been good from a loan standpoint, and as you all know, we make the money out of the loan program again to turn it into opportunities to do all these other things. When we get to line 17, Director Stolp, that's that $1 million that is reserved for drought declaration. And we hope that we don't have to use that, but this could be a year that needs to be tapped. And we wouldn't really see those expenses until in the spring of next year, by the time a lot of those expenses come around. The general fund transfer that Bill and Carly were talking about that has to be that is scheduled to be transferred out of the operational account. The perpetual base account has a refund that needs to go back to the general fund, that 11.425 that was identified in Senate Bill 17-260. So that's on our books. Chatfield reallocation, ownership, cost increase. Again, the next agenda item, we'll talk a little bit about that, but I am proposing that we reduce that from 8 million down to 4 million, and we'll talk later about the justification there. The transfers, line 20, 21, and 22 may be a little confusing the way they're listed out there. I wanted to show them as the placeholder because this board did authorize us to transfer the 10-5-10 for the water plan implementation funding in November that I'm now proposing is going to only be 11 million. And so I just left them in there as an identifier that we are not planning on transferring any money out for the WSRF out of the severance tax or the watershed program out of severance tax. Those will come out of construction fund by way of the transfer $10 million, which you can see on line item 22. And so that's my, I think that's covered all of the items for that. If you've got any questions on severance tax, and then I will jump into what I see as the next 3 years, the outlook for what the board has available.
Questions for Kirk up to this point? Seeing none, I also let the record reflect that Director Jan is here. Welcome, Director Jan.
Thank you.
Please continue.
Okay, I want to flip to the next page, and I show this to the board on occasion. Director Jan, did I? Okay, very good, thank you. So what we do is every so often we'll take a look at what the, I'll say, near long-term projection is for us. We start looking at what we've been doing typically and how that looks into the future. And it was this model that really gave us comfort that the $25 million for 3 years was realistic before the bottom dropped out of severance tax. And so on the screen, I thought it'd be a little easier to point out some of these items because we don't look at this very often. And I'm going to give you some real high-level numbers to maybe carry forward from year to year. We typically receive, and I think in terms of combining these accounts for the most part, I do some math keeping them separate, but for the most part, I think in terms of the two funds together, typically this board receives about $40 million in repayment of loans and the interest earning from those loans plus treasury. So $40 million is a routine flow of money in from those investments in water projects. And those would be the summation of line 4 on both sides, construction fund and severance tax. Federal mineral lease has been pretty steady at 10 million. Operations run about 10 million. So those balance each other out. So line 5 under construction fund and line 9 under construction fund, those balance each other out. So we've got incoming for loans and outgoing for loans if we anticipate we have about $40 million every year. So when you add line 8 across there, 15 million out of construction fund, 25 million out of severance tax. That's my 40 million that I anticipate each year for new loans. Obviously, one large repayment of a loan changes that available funding, allows us to do larger loans than that. As an example, when Aurora repaid theirs, it gave us an opportunity to loan a significant amount of money to Northern. You can see traditionally line number 10, about $4 million is necessary for those non-reimbursable investments that the board processes each September. And so I do all this work and I try to figure out how much is available for water plan implementation. And in next fiscal year, my crystal ball, the best that I could see based on all these assumptions. Oh, I forgot, I didn't stop at the severance tax revenue, which is line 5. The estimate is about 17 million next fiscal year. I am always leery of that number again, and I typically think, what if we only got half of that? Again, this year that failed me. We ended up with quite a bit less than that, but I put 17 in there, but I think in terms of what if it was about half, can we survive? Where would we squeeze? But if we assume that that's a good number, it provides about 10 million available for next year's projects bill in water plan implementation funding. This last number, line 9, item 14, I need about $10 million for CWCB's operations next year. And so I continue that cycle, and it doesn't change a whole lot next year. Again, 40 in, 40 out. Federal mineral lease at 10, operations out at 10, and then the projection is about 20 million for severance tax that far out, and we're getting worse and worse at our estimates or forecasting as we continue to move further out. My goal is to try to get this balance down to about what we have. I will share with this board that in 09, when the general fund swept the $170 million that was sitting in there unreserved, it's caused us to look at things like this. We need to spend it or we might lose it. So that's a lot of the reason we do this the way we do it, is try to continue to try to keep that balance down within striking distance of what we want to accomplish. So with that, that is the end of my presentation on the model, and then the next agenda item will speak of projects bill.
Questions at this point in time? Or
Can I say something?
Director Mitchell.
I think it's important to recognize that one thing that became very clear to me, and I think the staff, was that this process is and level of uncertainty is really difficult to deal with every year. And so as we're looking towards the future, it's important that that we come up with some sort of plan or process and policies, like Director George was mentioning, that that maybe dampen the effect of having to deal with this on an annual basis. And how do we get out there and advocate for long-term permanent funding? What does that look like? And we really need to strategize a process to do that as we move forward. And so it was not lost on me or the staff that this situation was something that we want to not be dealing with every year. So we'll be looking at how we move forward with that in mind.
Thank you, Director Mitchell. Let's move to agenda item 7A.
Kirk Russell, Finance Section Chief. I will talk about all of the items under agenda item 7, A, B, C, and D, and I will probably need some support from Eric Sky and Director Stolp for this first item. Item number 7A, and as I indicated, a lot has happened since the November board meeting when we requested the board to approve the requests that will go into the projects bill, and Andrew is handing out we usually call it a fact sheet, but I think it's better off called an outline at this time. It does have draft across it. It is our opportunity to share with the legislature, the sponsors of this year's bill, what the board would like. And again, this an interaction with the board. We will cover that particular list in agenda item D. But right now I want to talk agenda item A is a additional request for a non-reimbursable funding, and it has to do with the damaging high groundwater response grants that we feel at the staff level, and I think the board shares the same concern with the Gilcrest community and those communities along the South Platte dealing with high groundwater. Director Stolp has updated the section chief's leadership at CWCB regularly about the activities with those high groundwater issues. And we felt it was important to continue with some funding in this year's projects bill. So we're asking that the board consider $150,000 to really keep the ball rolling. And we are making some progress with some of those grants. And so we are requesting the board to approve funding of $150,000 for damaging high groundwater response grants in the South Platte. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions or ask Eric Sky or Director Stolp to support me as well.
Director McLeod.
Well, I understand the depth of the problem, Kirk, out on the South Platte, but we've spent a lot of money over several years. Is $150,000 really going to make a significant dent in the problem? And maybe that's for, I don't know.
Maybe we need to define dent.
It doesn't buy much in this day and age. That's why I'm wondering if it really makes any difference. Is it just a token, or is this really going to help?
Dr. Stolp.
Hey, Mr. Chairman and Director McLeod, I think it's a placeholder that if you look at this list of recommendations that we're working on right now, they range from and the projects we've helped fund, or the technical committee has directed funds, and this board's typically approved them, has ranged from as low as $1,000 to as high as $50,000 for different projects up there. And so we've spent in the neighborhood of $600,000 in the last 3 years, combination of severance tax that was designated by the legislature, as well as through the projects bill, as well as some internal Water Conservation Board funding. And so, but it's been a good investment, and I don't think you should think that this amount will take care of it. It's mainly so we can see some engineering correct proposals that people we're going to be willing to go to the next stage. The one engineering study that you financed through Gilchrist JVA indicated a range of a potential pipeline solution for the area, but the cost of it was going to be between $9 and $11 million. And so I think that was money still well spent at the time to do that engineering analysis. It wasn't designed to take care of the problem. There's no silver bullet up there, as we well discovered. And so it'll help us make better decisions in the future if we want to invest in a $9 million pipeline to benefit the region, or some of the other things. We have invested like, I think, $120,000 out in the Sterling area, and that's been very successful. It's used intermittently, but it's keeping an HOA dry. And so there's some working examples of how small amounts of money have worked well. And yet some of these engineering studies that I think have been very important indicate to us what the magnitude might be in the future. And we'll have to address those as funds become available.
Further questions? I don't believe so. Please,
Mr. Chairman, let me add one other thing. There's also, we've invested around, Eric helped me, $160,000 in the Gilchrist dewatering well, which is in the last stages of being connected to the system. And so that was an important investment that we will know hopefully in the next 3 to 6 months whether we need to invest in a bigger pipeline. But it will give us, I think, some relief for the town proper of Gilchrist and the immediate surrounding area. That's certainly the intention, and that's what the studies that we've done and the modeling we've done shows. So it's an ongoing process, and we could put several zeros behind that number, but it's not appropriate for the projects bill at this point.
One quick question, Kirk, and maybe for Dr. Stolp also. Are they building more houses in Gilchrist at this point in time, or is the economy kind of stabilized, I guess?
Mr. Chairman, I drive through Gilchrist a lot. There are some newer houses, but it's fairly stagnant on construction in that area. The good news is those houses and those businesses I see being built from scratch are usually built on 4 to 5 foot pads.
Great, thank you. Please continue, Kirk.
Okay, I have a staff recommendation to approve $150,000 for the project bill funding of damaging high groundwater response grants.
Director Yon.
Thanks, Kirk. I would move staff recommendation on the $150,000 for the project bill for the high groundwater. And I just want to also last year we approved one for the Highway 144 ranchettes as well. So there's little pockets in there that have benefited from these amounts of money quite a bit. So and the people are very thankful for that. So I would move that.
Motion by Director Yuan to move staff recommendation, agenda item 7A. Second by Director Hawkins. Further discussion, call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Let's move to agenda item 7B.
Kirk Russell, Finance Section Chief. Agenda item 7B is also a projects bill impact item. This is the Chatfield Reservoir Reallocation Project funding. In November, and even go back to the September Finance Committee meeting, I've presented to the board that there was a new estimate that came out of the project, the Chatfield Reallocation Project, which this board is about a 33% owner of. And that increase in project cost was requiring us to go back to the projects bill and request some additional funding appropriation for the increase in costs. At the time, we weren't sure if all of the other participants that are in the project were going to be able to come with additional funds, or if they would, there were several options. Some could take the off-ramp and not even participate, which would orphan funds that the board would then need to step up and pick up. Or there was some discussion that some of the participants might just stay with the funding they have, and it would in essence purchase less than they originally had signed up for. All of those items were up in the air at the time, and I'm glad to report that all of the participants have signed up for the full amount that they were on the hook for originally. And so the potential orphans of those shares, orphaning of those shares no longer exists. So we are asking the board to reduce that request from the legislature from 8 million down to 4 million, feeling that we can cover the increase in costs that are in front of us, and also have about $2 million for some contingency. And then also at the time that the original authorization for this project, they were looking at a O&M assessment estimate out 50 years. A lot has changed since that estimate was made. We feel that we're making some progress on selling some of these orphan shares as time goes on. Castle Rock has purchased some of the shares. There are a couple other entities that have shown interest in purchasing our orphan shares. We are in the construction phase of this project, which makes that a little bit clumsy. We're selling something we haven't built yet. But nonetheless, when those sales are made, it removes the board's obligation for the O&M costs annually. And so laying out what our estimate is on that, we feel that a $4 million appropriation from the legislature for this project is prudent. So with that, my recommendation is to reduce your previously approved 8 million down to 4 million and be included in the projects bill.
Questions for Kirk? I also see we have Mr. Tim Feehan in attendance. Is there any questions for Mr. Feehan? I don't believe so. Please go ahead.
I'm ready for a motion.
Director Wells.
I'll happily move staff recommendation to reduce the request to 4 million.
Motion by Director Wells to move staff recommendation, agenda item 7B, seconded by Director Yuan. Further discussion? All those in favor signify by an aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Let's move to agenda item 7C.
Kirk Russell, Finance Section Chief. I will be presenting 7C as well. And welcome, Mr. Feehan. The Chatfield reallocation project will also be discussed later in the loan increase timeframe as well. So Tim will be available for questions there. Agenda item 7C is also a projects bill item, and it is the request from the board to reverse the $30 million that the board put in the loan guarantee fund in last year's projects bill. A reminder, last year's projects bill, we created the loan guarantee fund. That fund, and the intent of that fund was to assist large regional projects that had pool financing. As many of you know, it's very difficult when everybody tries to line up their own financing for a project. There is a desire to maintain this fund. At this time, it just, we feel it is not as high a priority as a lot of the other things that the board is interested in doing. And so we have requested to reverse that. We'll have to go back in the projects bill and move that from that recently created loan guarantee fund back into severance tax for use in the lineup that I presented earlier in the budget discussion. And with that, I think I'm happy to take questions.
Questions for Kirk? Director Wells.
So what is the motion that we're making? It says we should transfer the money, but is the motion that we should ask the General Assembly to transfer the money?
Yes, thank you. That is correct.
In that case, I would make that motion.
First of all, is there any further discussion? All right. We have a motion by Director Wells, a second by Director Randall to move staff recommendation 7C. Hearing no further discussion, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. All right, let's move to agenda item 7D.
Kirk Russell, Finance Section Chief. This is the last agenda item under the projects bill discussion. And it is, it's really a summary item. And I will share with the board that this is fairly typical. When we get to January, things have occurred between November and the January meeting, some of which are not necessarily at the staff level, but maybe some influences from the project bill sponsors. But at this time in the process, in the January meeting, it is customary that staff presents the board with the framework for the projects bill in a kind of a summary fashion. And we jumped to the conclusion that maybe the board would agree with our recommendations under those previous items, and they are listed in here accordingly. And I would, before I jump to the third page here, the bottom of the first page, I wanted to remind the board that every year we are required to send a report to the Senate and House Ag Committee Chair members, a report from the previous calendar year's loans that the board approved under $10 million. A reminder that this board has authorization to approve up to $10 million. Anything over $10 million must go to the projects bill. That report, we did not include any digital form or paper form. It is available at the legislative website under colorado.gov. If you wanted to take a look at it there, if you would like access to that or need additional information, you've seen all those projects over the course of this year. 15 projects, upwards, I think, of $40 million are listed in that lineup. The draft of this projects bill fact sheet, if you really fast forward, most of the stuff on page 2 is the items that were reviewed at the September Finance Committee meeting and then final approval in November. No changes. It isn't until you get to page 3, section J, where we included the $150,000 South Platte high groundwater funding. Section K is the oh, I'm sorry. This is where I need to pause here, catch up with myself. Section K, what I'd like to mention to the board, because of the order of the agenda, this one kind of falls into a little bit of a chicken and an egg issue. So Section K will be discussed along with the loan increases. And Jonathan Hernandez will be presenting the board a increase to the the Central Water Conservancy District, their loan increase for orphan share purchase. And through that discussion, you'll hear what we did the last time Central Water Conservancy District purchased their shares. This board approved a grant to offset the cost of that purchase in order to maintain flows through the metro area. And so because we've got this ahead of those loan requests, and changing the agenda item at the time was going to be clumsy, you will hear more about that. So if this board would want to reserve decisions on this particular item until you hear that presentation, I can certainly respect that. But Section K is a $500,000 request for grant funding to Central. You have a question?
Is there any board members that would like this modified from our present agenda? I don't believe so, Kirk.
Well,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Director George.
yeah. You can do it one of two ways. You can go do 10 or 10, whatever it is. And if you're positive there, then you don't need to change this. Or you can just wait for this motion until we finish the number 10 item. It's either way, but it's just almost a bookkeeping prospect.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Director George. I will share with the board that this is listed as a non-action item. And normally it's just an update to the board. Here's where we are. This is where we're moving forward. And usually there is an action required. And I think in this case, we have kind of transitioned with, there are so many changes in this that action, I think, would be important. And so I think it would be wise to delay the actual motion for approval, because I do believe this does warrant that kind of action until after the loan request that includes this particular grant item occurs later.
All right, we will proceed with that then. We will do it that way.
Section L refers to the water plan implementation proposal, and it is you can see that it's an $11 million proposal, which is a reduction from what the board approved in November. As indicated earlier, when the severance tax revenue bottom dropped out, we came together and strategically tried to figure out where best to pull and push funds in order to accomplish all that the board is interested in. And so $11 million is the number that allowed enough for loans and still provide some momentum for implementation of the projects bill. So in essence, Section L was $25 million, and now we're proposing an $11 million. And if you remember last year, we used the term 10-5-10, 10 for the Water Supply Reserve Fund transfer to supplement their funding, and $5 million for watershed restoration. Now, in essence, the term would be 227. And so the lineup there, and again, this is the proposal from staff to the board, that $2 million would be transferred from the construction fund to the Water Supply Reserve Fund. I would point out that the $10 million that was in last year's projects bill for this exact effort was transferred in its normal fashion from the CWCB Perpetual Base Fund to the Water Supply Reserve Fund and distributed in the 40-30-30 sequence, 40% in July, 30% in January, and then the last 30% of that 10 million has yet to be distributed, which would be in April of this year. I know there are some internal discussions about whether that 3 million should be carried forward in maybe a longer term distribution, but this 2 million would add to that 3 million that is yet dispersed to the Water Supply Reserve Fund recipients. The $2 million for watershed restoration, the second bullet there, that was the 5 million last year. We are proposing to reduce that to 2 million this year. And then the lineup of items below that, starting with 3 million. We have had some complications with the difference between implementing the water plan through the supply demand gap funding bucket and storage, because a lot of times they would line up with common efforts. We are proposing to combine those and make that a $3 million bucket, in essence, in next year's projects bill. And then on down the list, $1 million grant funding for conservation land use and drought planning efforts, $500,000 for education outreach and innovation, $1 million for technical assistance to help reduce dry up of agriculture, and then the last item, the $1.5 million environment and rec recommendation funding. Now, with this lineup, I will share with the board that we looked at the demand that came in for grant funding in last year's water plan funding grants, and also how long it takes some of these larger projects to gain momentum, especially storage, and some of these larger supply demand projects maybe have taken longer to develop. We feel that this distribution of funding will help the board achieve as much as we can for the limited funds that are available. And I've talked about a lot there under Section L. I don't know if it would be good to stop there for discussion.
Director McLeod.
Well, Kirk, and I don't have a specific question about this distribution, although I think we could talk about that a little bit more. But you know, we've always pursued the water plan implementation as a grassroots effort, ground up sort of thing. What we're doing here is converting the funding activity from a roundtable level through the Water Supply Reserve Fund to the state. That is our staff. We are the state. We think that's a good thing. Not everyone else does. And that may be okay, because when these are water plan implementation grants, we, the board and the staff, have a lot more management control over what the money is spent on and how much is spent on each project. But perhaps we should adhere to the principle of local control by making a roundtable endorsement a requirement. Right now, it's a good idea, right? But it's not required for these applicants for water plan implementation grants to get an endorsement from the roundtable. Am I correct about that?
Yes, we worked pretty hard at trying to navigate that requirement, or I guess suggestion, I think maybe the term we use to soften that. I think my opinion of your comment would be that it is seen in some cases it's very difficult for the roundtable to have enough information to be comfortable to support. And sometimes that would even cause delays in the approach to get in front of this board for final approval. We really wanted to leave it somewhat open-ended in that it was not a requirement to have Basin Roundtable approval of it. We certainly would hear through the grapevine if there were some rumblings within a roundtable that it was not supported. I think you had indicated early on, just because it's in a BIP list did not necessarily give it the credibility that it needed at the grassroots level. But I think all of that wrapped up into, I guess, again, my opinion, and Director Mitchell is certainly can step in here and provide hers as well. But I think allowing us to have that flexibility that if, you know, at the state level, it is a project that needs to move forward without basin approval, but out of respect for the basin, being aware that they have heard it, or if it did require some interaction at that grassroots level, that the board can trust staff will be there to do that.
Well, I don't misunderstand me. I don't mistrust the staff, and I think you've done an excellent job with the projects that we've seen so far, and the ones that we'll see today. That's not my concern. I hate this term, but it's the optics that I'm worried about, because we've always promoted this as a grassroots effort, and this looks suspiciously like we're moving it away from the roundtables and putting it in the hands of the state. Now, as I said, those of us at this table are perfectly comfortable with that, because we appreciate the fine quality of the staff we have and the good work that you do here, and I'm not in any way suggesting that that's not great stuff. Has been, and I'm sure it will continue to be. I'm just concerned that at the roundtable level, people are saying, wait a minute, you're taking this out of our hands and moving it to Denver. And the local folks are becoming uncomfortable with that, frankly. And if an applicant for this kind of grant or presentation well enough organized to get it to the roundtable, I mean, the same problem is there with the Water Supply Reserve Fund. As you know, in Gunnison, we've struggled with the timetable because of the intermittent meeting schedule for the roundtable and so on. And that's a local problem. But still, if we require that for the Water Supply Reserve Fund, in other words, it has to pass through the filter of the roundtable before we even look at it, why is this different? And I'm just talking about a policy issue here, not the absolute, not the result, which has been good. And as far as I know, we haven't had any significant pushback yet from the roundtables about this process, but I see it building out there in the hinterlands, and I'm worried about how this is perceived when we don't ask the roundtable endorsement. Well, I mean, we suggest it, but it's not required. And I'm thinking maybe a requirement might be a change in policy we should consider.
Director Mitchell and then Director.
I definitely think this is an area that we need to look at again. When these water plan grants first began, there was timing issues, there was staffing issues, and we all know that comfort level with both staff and board changes as changes happen. And so we want to make sure that we create a program that can live on beyond the staff or the board. And so I do believe that we have to think about that as we're looking at the criteria and guidelines that they make folks comfortable. That being said, the focus of these water plan grants were projects of statewide significance that stretched the bounds of the basins and were beyond the bounds of just singular basins oftentimes. And so there was some difficulty with that, but I do think that this is an area that we have to look at and read and look at the criteria and decide if this is the best way to go about it. These basin roundtables have been incredibly important to what's happened and the progress that has been made in the state with Colorado's water plan and the IBCC and just moving projects and programs and processes forward. And I don't want to brush them to the side at this point. That is not the goal or intention. I want to make sure that we highlight the fact that the severance tax was predicting 0 to water supply reserve account last year, and we figured out a way to make that become whole. And then again this year, based on how water supply reserve fund would be funded, we would be at 0 there. And so there is still an importance on the basin roundtables, and to have put $2 million into that water supply reserve fund really expresses the interest from the CWCB staff level that we consider those an important piece of the process moving forward. I think it's a longer conversation about how we look to them in the water plan grant program. So not much light, but enough to say we need to have more conversation.
Thank you, Director Mitchell. Let's do Director Hawkins and then Director Randall.
I wanted to follow up on Director McLeod's discussion. I'm finding at the Southwest Basin Roundtable, the roundtable's work to vet funding applications has gotten significantly more complicated with additional pots of funding. And as we think through this, I think we need to be mindful that the criteria for WSRF and for water plan implementation are different. And I was wondering if we were going to retain the double meeting, because it seems to me that there might be an opportunity for staff to do a review and for the roundtable review to come in between the meetings. I'm throwing it out there because I'm a little concerned that we need to give the roundtables enough tools to actually vet, given the difference in the criteria between the two types of funding.
Director Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to build on something that Director Mitchell said, and that really is, I really view this element of the projects bill as not minimizing the importance of the work of the Basin Roundtables, but rather recognizing its importance by backfilling what would otherwise be zero out of severance tax. In the last year, the $10 million in the projects bill was supplemented by the July distributions of severance tax tier 2. And so in the last year, to the tune of what was it? 2 or 3 million that were distributed in July based on the revenue forecasts. And so in the last year, the Basin Roundtables, the funding headed their way was in addition to what they would otherwise get due to severance tax revenue. And as a tier 2 program, again, those are the last buckets to get filled. And so really, I just wanted to support the proposal. I think it's looking at account balances, looking at the available funding, and making what I view as strategic choices for that. I recognize that it represents a choice. But again, I think just looking at the available funds and with the Water Supply Reserve Fund being a tier 2 program that would otherwise get nothing, I think this is an important injection.
I agree with everything both Director Mitchell and Director Randall have said, and that's important. My point is a little different. My point is just, I'm not challenging, as I said when I started, any of these allocations, either from the 2 million and then the breakdown of the water plan implementation funds. I'm just talking about the process. We have a policy where when you see it from the Gunnison Basin, it's, does the roundtable decide or does Denver decide where this money is spent? I fully appreciate the fact that this 10 million backfilled what would not have been there. And the 2 million is doing the same thing. And just parenthetically, when you take the 2 million and say, what does the basin fund in the Gunnison Roundtable look like? It's about $100,000. So, sounds like a big number, but when you get down to the roundtable level, it's fairly small. That's not a criticism. I absolutely agree that we are doing a good thing to backfill on that Water Supply Reserve Fund. But we have a total of $11 million. 2 million is filtered through the roundtable, 9 million is not. That's my only point. Okay? And my question is, should we have another look at our policy where we would find some mechanism? And I think Director Hawkins had a very good idea where the roundtables could get a chance to vet these. And I heard Director Mitchell point out the fact that these are projects of statewide significance, but if you look at the list, they're all still pretty local. So I'm just worried about this grassroots issue being overlooked. No other criticism of the program, okay?
Director Gallagher.
Thank you, Director McClough, all of you who have commented on this. And I feel the same way as Director McClough. I think that the optics are very important to maintain here. This is a grassroots effort we're trying to do. The projects themselves, even these, while they have statewide impact, some of them are local, and it really calls into question the continuing role of the roundtable. And I think it's very important to retain this grassroots approach. So I've told our roundtable that we'd be very pleased if we could receive support for any of these grants that don't necessarily have to go through the roundtable from them, because we here at the table want to see that there is roundtable support, and I certainly do. That's been my message to my roundtable. Thank you.
Director Wells.
Well, first of all, I don't think decisions are made, in Denver. I mean, the board and the staff represent the state as a whole. So I understand that may be how some people feel, but that seems unfair. But with regard to having to have approval, seems to me there's a difference between that and consultation and getting a review and a comment. Because if you have to have approval, then that means the opposite side of that is a veto, and whether that's really fair either. But I don't see any reason not to have a process by which the roundtable weighs in. They may say, gee, we like this other project better, or, you know, we don't like this. I don't know exactly what they might say, but having their response, their formal response makes sense. But having it to be a barrier, I think, is maybe not the best idea.
Director McLeod.
Well, then by the same token, shouldn't we remove the requirement that the roundtable approve the Water Supply Reserve Fund grants? I mean, that they have the veto there. And that hasn't ever been a barrier, right? I mean, I'm just trying to say we're not being logically consistent. And by the way, I was using Denver as a shorthand, but I don't see a difference where we have this, we have a pot of money. One category requires the roundtable to review and approve. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and Kirk, you don't deal with all of these personally, but we very rarely get a rejection from the roundtables on any of these, even when they've just commented on the implementation plan grants. It's very rare, in my experience, that the roundtables say no. But it does have an impact on how the projects are described and created and how the money is distributed. So again, I'm not trying to disrupt the program because it's done great work and it's been very successful, but I still think we need to be careful about cutting out the roundtables as part of the process.
Actually, we need to go to Director Yon, and then then to Director Wells.
All right, thank you. I appreciate this discussion, and it's a good one to have. And I appreciate that we need to make sure that, you know, that we're doing the work of the people of Colorado. And I know the board, just like Director McLeod said, the board and the staff have that interest in mind. And I was just trying to think practically how we do this. I know with water and implementation grants, we're trying to do this to keep the ball rolling, and we're trying to do this fairly quickly, and we're trying to do what we think is right. And I know with the staff, they have a lot of work, and they look at them very carefully. And so I know, you know, they've given all these a lot of thought. And we try to, at the roundtable, weigh in if someone comes to us. But it is difficult, even if you have a 2-month window and the roundtable is going to, or I mean a 2-meeting window with us, and the roundtable has to weigh in between there. I'm not sure if every roundtable meets every month. Ours does, almost every month. Sometimes in December we don't meet, but just the whole idea of getting these to the roundtable, having them act on them. I know we have procedures at our roundtable that takes a while. You have to have everything in front of the roundtable. They have to all be able to look at it, which is good. I like that. But I'm just wondering if Director Hawkins was suggesting that maybe it was a little less formal, where you just have the opportunity for a roundtable to, at our next hearing, the roundtable could come in and say, here's the problems we have with this. And, you know, we could all hear that if they have a problem, rather than even if there's just individuals in the roundtable that have and we just let them know that, hey, we're going to be acting on this. We heard this at one meeting. We're going to be acting on it at the next meeting. We don't actually need your formal approval, but we would like to hear from you if you have any problems, or if you want to volunteer some words of support. So I was just wondering if it could be a little bit more informal, but still have that grassroots feel of the way that we're going to do this.
Chairman Watberg, okay, real quick.
Go ahead, Kirk.
And Becky, feel free to correct this. We have been looking internal. You know, this is a new process for us. As you indicated, Director Yon, we were pushing hard to get the ball rolling. It was really our mission to the bill sponsors. You know, why are we doing this different? It's just we want to have sooner impact on things, and I think we rallied that pretty well. It is the desire of staff, and I think this is supported by Director Mitchell, that we wanted to probably get this more in line with an annual meeting approval. And we've even talked internally that maybe this is an August 1 kind of application date, and then a subsequent board meeting, whether it's a 2-meeting approval process. We we found that that was a little clumsy, I think, as the board did, but maybe all this discussion about maybe lining that up to allow the basins to see what the board heard at the first meeting. And I guess that would end up being a 2-meeting process. But I think all this is really good information, good feedback for us. But we do have some time. And just a reminder, while we're on this water plan funding, this board meeting, you'll hear the final approval of the second round of applications. I think there's about $250,000 left if you add up all the funds for the last application date, which is February 1, so in a week or so, for the final round this fiscal year, and then everything will be carried over to the next fiscal year. But I think our desire is to probably do this one time in the fall, late summer, fall, and we can line this this message to staff up with that.
Director Wells. Okay. Director Mitchell.
I just wanted to add one more statement as we're thinking about how we move forward with this, that we recognize that the board really wears that statewide hat. And when this program was developed, that it was important that it was focused on statewide implementation of Colorado's water plan, and that that was part of the reason why it was developed as a separate fund outside of the WSRF program. And so I think there's some benefit to that. I think that it could very easily be a board policy that there's a mandatory check-in, that staff is mandated. I hate saying that word, but that staff is mandated to check in with the roundtables and keep them apprised of what's going on with these water plan implementation grants, and go from there.
All right. I know nobody's bashful here. Any other board members want to weigh in on this before we? Director Hawkins.
Thank you. I have some additional questions on the split that we're seeing here. It is a slightly different topic, so I don't want to get in front of any other final discussion on this.
Are we done with the current discussion? I think we are. Yeah.
I had 2 questions on the split that we're seeing here. The first one is in the $3 million bucket, I see a reference to projects that are multi-beneficial. And I'm wondering what that means, because you described this as primarily the storage and
we tried to put as much information in the small space as we could here. I think there are so many different projects that can fit in those categories. I think the desire is that there would be an influence on the staff and the board that those projects that come in that are single beneficiary would not be elevated as well as a project that comes in, especially when it comes to storage and projects that are trying to deal with the gap. If there's a way for it to solve multiple problems, I think that's what we're pushing for. So it wasn't necessarily that it was an absolute, but a reminder that that's a priority.
Thanks. And then the second part of that is the description of the ag bucket looks a little different than the prior years. And I was wondering if you could describe, is this more limited than what we had last year?
I would say that would be the author's doing, and that would be me. I know that when we summarize our activities for reporting to the governor and how they relate to the water plan implementation, there is a focus on reducing the dry up of agriculture. And I think last year's projects bill, I think, just was tagged with the title agriculture. And I think we had a lot of applications that didn't hone in on the fact that we're trying to reduce the dry up of ag. Now that might be to help agriculture with infrastructure that's failing, but I think our priority is to target the reduction of dry up of ag. And so I included that in this fact sheet as maybe a driver. And if the board disagrees with that, I'm happy to take that out and make it the way it was last year.
Thanks. I just wanted some clarification there.
Everyone good with what it was last year? Director Dutton.
Kirk, thanks for the explanation, and I understand that you're trying to say a lot in a really small space. I would be concerned about just leaving it like it is, and I think we should probably maybe look at last year's, just because some of the projects, especially some of the ones we're going to review today, probably wouldn't be categorized as keeping ag from drying up, but they're very helpful for the producers. And especially there was the one that's going to reduce selenium and other water quality impairments as runoff. And so those are some projects that have truly multiple benefits that maybe wouldn't quite just be reducing dry up. So I would be more comfortable and would push us to make sure that it's a little broader in helping ag.
Thank you, directors. I just wanted to reemphasize that, and that that was the intention with this bucket, always with the funds, that it was, we have the ATM fund that's separate from this that really focuses on the prevention of ag dry up. So when this fund was developed and when this bucket was developed, the purpose was all types of agricultural projects. And so I don't think this was an intentional verbiage, that the intention was for it to be like it was last year, with the focus on, we have a fund that's specifically set up that's beyond this one.
Any other questions on that? All right.
I've got a few more items that I want to highlight. And again, the goal at the end of this explanation is to really target on the funding. Certainly we'll make the adjustments on these language suggestions, but we're targeting the request in the projects bill. Section M, the next item there is has to do with that reduction from 8 to 4 that the board just heard. Flipping over to the last page, there are two items listed under project loans. The first one is a loan that was approved by the board, I want to say back in September maybe, for the Pueblo Conservancy District for some levee repair work. That is over 10 million, so it will go in the projects bill. Section S is the increases in the Chatfield loan, or the Chatfield loans as they relate to the increase in costs. There was some debate with staff and the controller's office that those loans were in projects bill prior, because the whole project exceeded 10 million. And so the controller requested us that we modify that in this year's projects bill as an increase. And so that's why those are listed. And if you total them up, they're over 10 million, as it's shown 11.9 million. And those will be heard by the board later as well, out of order. The last, you can see the notes at the bottom. We do have some items that we're that are not directly appropriation or approval money-wise. The $30 million transfer is listed there. We do have a request to change some statutory language. The first one is the Healthy River Funds statutory language. In order for us to have spending authority, in order to utilize that funding, we need to put that continuously appropriated language into the statute. That's what's being listed there. The next statutory revision is actually a cleanup item. We made some changes in a previous projects bill to allow us to allow us to do distribution lines beyond the treatment plant. We had it listed as almost contrasting information in the same statute. So we need to clean that up so that they're both the same. The last item there listed is an increase in the amount of time from July 1 of 2018. We're extending a year for us to utilize general fund funds for the natural hazard mapping appropriation that was made. We just need an additional year's time to get those project funds. And I believe Kevin Hauk is here if you have any questions regarding to that. The last item before I turn it back over to you, Chairman Wattenberg, I did have a change to the memo. As you'll see, the memo went out earlier than the modifications. A lot of this projects bill stuff has rallied in the last week, somewhat as a result of the severance tax. listed as number 4 in that list in the board memo, it talks about the extension of the dredging grant funding appropriation. I can remind the board that a couple years ago, after we went through the process with the board, the project sponsor added $1 million from the construction fund for dredging work. It is a 50-50 match for dredging. The requirement to have that done is June 30th of this year. And it was interesting, for about a year and a half, we have seen no activities related to requests for that funding. And even within the last month or so, Anna Moss has taken over that effort. And I think has been a significant increase in interest in that. Add that to the fact that the water plan implementation funding effort kind of lines up with dredging as an available use of funds. And so we thought we could spend that money. We were just going to let that deadline pass, close up that phase of dredging funding at that 50-50 match, and let it line up with all the other storage and multi-beneficial projects that are in the water plan funding grant program. And so that we're striking that as a recommendation. So I apologize for that late change there. And that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to take any more questions.
Questions for Kirk at this time? All right, Director Young.
Back up just a second.
Certainly.
So back to section L, and maybe just on the division of the money. I was wondering, it seemed after I was Director Dutton and I were looking at some of these, how much have been requested in the past. I was just wondering about the $1 million for long-term strategies for conservation land use. How much of that money was used prior? It seemed like there wasn't a lot of requests for that, and I was wondering if putting the full $1 million in there, because I know there were a lot of requests for education and outreach, and I just wondered how you came up with that.
I believe the conservation funding requests to date are fairly low, and I think it's shown under agenda item 30. Actually, be 29. The tally of requests to date, and I believe actually I can get to it real quick. The conservation has about $750,000 available. It is my understanding through Kevin Reedy, who's kind of in charge of that bucket, that there is quite a list of potential candidates for that funding. I know that we internally were trying to figure out how to balance the funding somewhat from an optics standpoint, but also where the demand is to funds available, and we honed in on this $1 million as still a significant priority, with the potential that $750,000 might have more interest at the February 1 deadline. Maybe some guesswork in that. But again, I think there's just certain projects that have taken longer to develop, and that's what we're trying to prepare for as well.
I also wanted to mention to the board that this includes conservation, land use, and drought planning. And there may be some more need for drought planning from what we're hearing on the ground. And then also with the work that's happened recently with all the land use and developing best management practices, there's some greater potential for folks coming in for that fund. And so that was part of the reasoning on this. So I think that's important to remember.
Thank you.
All right, further questions for Kirk? There may be some here after a little bit. Actually, we do have a couple of folks from the public that would like to speak. Abby Burke and Aaron Citron. And whoever would like to go first. And if you would please identify yourself, if you would please. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Director Wattenberg, members of the board. My name is Aaron Citron. I'm a policy advisor with the Nature Conservancy here in Colorado, and wanted to also speak to the breakdown of Section 11 that Kirk Russell just went through, and primarily to thank you all, recognizing how difficult the financial situation is. And as we heard, it seems to not be improving anytime soon. my point in coming up here was just to, again, support the value of continuing to invest in water plan implementation writ large. I think that the breakdown, the 227 breakdown, makes quite a bit of sense. And as many of you have heard me say a number of times in the past, feel strongly, the Nature Conservancy feels strongly that the value of that water plan implementation fund is to make sure that we are providing additional funding for projects that really don't have anywhere else to look for support. I think that the breakdown, as I understand it, although I'm sure there's a million questions to ask between supply and demand, storage, conservation, and as Director Mitchell mentioned, drought planning, which is potentially going to be quite important looking at the snowpack this year, are critical areas to focus on, and want to particularly thank you all for increasing the environment and rec allocation from $1 million to $1.5 million, and we'll do our best to spend that. And we always, I think that the conversation that was being had earlier about the local versus statewide control is a really valid and interesting one. And for what it's worth, particularly with the environment and rec projects, I know we always do our best to make sure we're working with and through the roundtables, because that's where those projects really hit home. I'll leave it to you all to figure out the policy recommendation there, but thought that was very important. Wanted to thank you all and recommend, or we would very much support that breakdown. I think Abby Burke also wants to say something on behalf of Audubon.
Question for Aaron. Thank you for the presentation.
Ottenberg. My name is Abby Burke. I'm the Western Rivers Program Lead for Audubon Rockies, which is a regional office of the National Audubon Society. And so I'd first like to thank you for the $25 million in water plan implementation funds from last year. That has really seen some fruit on the ground as far as pushing implementation forward. And we certainly recognize the challenges with the volatility of severance tax and funding. And funding is extremely important, as you know, to continuing progress of water plan implementation and for public momentum for implementation. Audubon is a very purple organization. And in our Rivers program, our Western Rivers Action Network, we have over 10,000 folks across Colorado in our Rivers program alone. And water plan implementation is a key focus for our constituency. Particularly important to our constituency is the water plan implementation dollars invested in environmental and recreational projects. With all priorities considered, we strongly support the proposal of $7 million in water plan implementation, $2 million for stream management plan and watershed projects, and the $2 million for WSRF funds. And additionally, I respectfully ask the board for continued support for Colorado's rivers and streams, watersheds and wildlife, the agricultural and invaluable economies, and our drinking water that these systems support. So thank you.
Questions for Abby? Thank you for your presentation. All right. We are just about finished with agenda item 7, A, B, C, and D. Kirk.
I guess just in closing, I know that there are some items out of order relative to this final approval. I guess I would suggest that the board come back and reconsider this after those items are lined up, and we'll figure out when best that should happen. And I apologize. I think this took a lot longer than I had anticipated. A lot has changed over the last, even over the last 2 weeks. So,
other questions for Kirk? Excellent discussion, board. Covered a lot of ground there. Let's move to agenda item 8, Species Conservation Trust Fund. Carly, good morning.
Good morning, Director Wattenberg and members of the board. It's great to see you all. I'm here with our list of potential projects for Species Conservation Trust Fund funding. This is severance tax tier 2 funded, and we've discussed that at length today, the situation of our severance tax tier 2 funding. So I'll touch on that briefly, but I won't dive in too deep because of that. First, a little bit of background on what the Species Conservation Trust Fund is. This was created in 1998. It's a fund that's meant to help the state of Colorado either participate in programs that recover endangered or threatened or candidate species in our state, or that affect our state, such as through the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. Those species that are being recovered are actually in Nebraska, but directly affects water users in the state of Colorado. That's a primary mechanism of funding the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. Additionally, scientific studies, certain projects and programs that relate to the recovery of species in our state are all funded through this mechanism. The money is actually appropriated to the Department of Natural Resources, and then DNR works with CPW and CWCB to determine what those projects of primary interest are to the state. We start talking about this in late summer, early fall, and come up with our recommendations and get this prepared to go before the legislature fairly well in advance. And so there's a lot of communication and coordination between us and our partner agency with CPW. So moving on to what the balance is today for the SCTF. Well, like I said, we started talking about this late summer, and DNR said we don't know exactly how much we'll have, but every year we're asked to think about $5 million for DNR as a whole. This year, CWCB was asked to come up with $2 million worth of projects to fund, and then CPW to have up to $3 million worth of projects to fund. There was the idea that, we don't know exactly what will happen with SCTF funding. As the months evolved, we saw that indeed we were likely to be zeroed out on our SCTF capability for this year. So what I'm going to present to you today is our wish list in case we get some magic money from the general fund, as actually happened last year. Last year, we got $4.1 million appropriated, sent to the SCTF fund as part of a Senate Bill 17259. So it's worth spending a little bit of time to get to know these projects, just in case we do get that influx of funding. At that point, staff will come back with either a director's report or a brief item on the agenda to tell you how the status of whether or not these SCTF projects are funded for the year. Our recommended projects, first of all, up to $600,000 for the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. This helps meet our existing obligation through that program, which Becky talked about today. We're making really good progress with that program, by the way. We have an annual update on that I believe I'll give you in May. But in general, we are getting closer to determining the next step as far as an extension of the program and the current work that we're doing, extending that out for the next 13 years. Really positive work there, and this just helps us continue to meet that commitment. With non-native fish control, we're asking for up to $500,000. That will be used for projects such as that help achieve the objectives of programs like the Upper Colorado River Recovery, Endangered Fish Recovery Program. Projects, the big ticket item that's on our radar right now is the installation of a screen at Ridgeway Reservoir to decrease the escape of illegally stocked fish into the Uncompahgre River below the dam. There's other projects that we have in the past put money towards and might do again, would include incentivized angler harvests, mechanical removal, and that type of thing. With selenium management, this is something that you've seen come before the board several years running. This helps to implement the Gunnison Basin Selenium Management Program, which helps us understand and measure and work towards helping endangered fish that are in the Gunnison Basin that would be exposed to selenium from to help with their recovery, because selenium is a major concern for fish in that basin. This year, we've done something a little different. We have opened up a possibility for the Arkansas River Basin by in this memo by simply acknowledging that selenium concentrations often exceed the average monthly exposure of 3.1 micrograms per liter. that is something that we're just trying to think more about the ways that we can work on other issues throughout the state regarding selenium management. There's a water quality work group, which Brentful briefly mentioned, but I'm a member of in the Lower Arkansas, that's focused on what do we do to manage selenium. So we're starting to think about ways to take what we've learned in the Gunnison Basin and at the very beginning stages of thinking what that looks like in the Arkansas. So here we acknowledge that the Arkansas darter, which is a state listed species, is present in that system, and that selenium problem exists in that system. And then finally, we've listed the Morgan Bottom Irrigation Delivery and Habitat Enhancement Project. This is something that was funded back in 2014, but this is probably the newer project of all of the things on this list to several of you. This project is something that CWCB is working on with partners in the Yampa Basin, including the Nature Conservancy at Morgan Bottom near Hayden, which is a 14-mile reach of the Yampa River. The funding for this project would be applied to an upgrade of Williams Ditch, which is a point of diversion that needs some improvements to reduce bank erosion and to improve fish passage, and also tangentially recreational boat passage. That diversion would probably cost about $1 million, so this $800,000 would get us part of the way there. And the species that we are interested in there are the bluehead sucker, the flannelmouth sucker, and the round-tailed chub, which are 3 sensitive species that are of concern under a range-wide conservation agreement and strategy that we are a party to with the Utah Department of Natural Resources. So those are the 4 projects that I have to ask for your consideration today. I can take questions and then give you my official staff recommendation if that works for you, Director Wattenberg.
Questions for Carly. Director Yon.
Thanks, Carly. So this is a wish list. If you wouldn't get up to $2 million, is there a hierarchy of the projects that you would do, or would you partially fund all of them, or how would that look?
Thank you, Director Yan. I can point you directly to sort of the middle page of page 2. What we're asking here is that you would authorize these amounts up to these amounts, and then we'll proportionally reduce them unless something else comes up and we'll need to come back to the board or make some phone calls and tell you. But proportionally is how we're thinking about things.
Dr. Wells.
Well, I guess maybe I have a recommendation for proportion. It seems to me that project number 4 is different in kind significantly in significant ways. And it doesn't mean that it's not a great idea. And I'll defer to Director Gallagher, but the first 3 are recovery programs, long-term programs that benefit multiple water users throughout the state. And this one, you did mention Utah, so that's helpful. But it seems a little bit from the description that, outdated and poorly sited irrigation infrastructure, riparian vegetation was removed, that human activity made it worse. So I guess if I had to choose, if there were a reduction, from my perspective, number 4 doesn't seem to have quite the same statewide impact as the other 3. So my 2 cents.
Thank you, Director Wells. May I address that comment?
Yes, and then Director Gallagher.
Oh, Director Gallagher, you're welcome to proceed. Sorry.
Why don't you respond to that?
Thank you.
I'll make my comment after.
Thank you, Director Wells, for that comment and concern. And that's definitely something that we thought about a lot during this process. The reason that has a higher allocation than the others is that the others are in relatively stable places right now. And but I understand that. And I think that if we do get funding, it's highly likely that we'll have to make some cuts, and we'll definitely include your comments in consideration.
Director Gallagher.
Thank you, Carly, for your presentation. And I do appreciate the comments of Director Wells. This is different. It does look different. And I agree with that. most of the upper Colorado recovery program in the Yampa is below Elkhead Reservoir. This is a reach above there, which is of importance in an area that's been heavily ranched and heavily impacted, and some help from multiple sources, both NGOs as well as the state and private landowners, to improve this very unique stretch of 14 miles through a prime agricultural area in the central Yampa Basin. And I would hate to see it put down to the category that it's not of statewide interest, because it does have an impact on what happens lower down in the system. As I said, right now, our only source and for mitigation in the lower basin part of the Yampa is Elkhead. This is a reach above that section, which addresses this problem. Last November, the group, the consortium of stakeholders, completed this project to connect the Gibraltar ditch back into the channel, but in the same process, they created a low water fish channel, which is going to enhance the viability of these species all the way up into the upper Yampa Canyon there. And so we believe that while it's fairly local in the activity there, that this is going to revitalize this section of the Yampa where these endangered fish are threatened. So I'd like to see it kept in, and I would support a proportional reduction if it were to happen.
Director Hawkins.
Well, we're on project 4. I need to disclose to the board that the Nature Conservancy, which is my employer, is potentially the recipient of this funding, and so I am going to recuse myself from discussion and voting today to avoid a conflict.
Andrew, if you would let the record reflect that. Further questions for Carly? We have staff recommendation.
Director Rottenberg, staff recommends, contingent on appropriations, that the board first concur with the DNR executive director's proposed recommendations to the General Assembly to approve an expenditure up to $5 million from the Species Conservation Trust Fund for fiscal year 18-19, including $2 million for the CWCB-led projects and programs outlined herein, and second, forward a statement of concurrence to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission.
Director Gallagher.
If there's no more discussion on this issue, I'd make a motion to approve staff recommendation.
Motion by Director Gallagher, second by Director McLeod to move staff recommendation, agenda item 8. Further discussion? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. All right, when we get, we need to do a little bit of changing around here. We've run afoul of our time schedule. We need to do agenda item 10 before we break for lunch. We have some folks that have to be other places. Is that agreeable with the board to do that? I believe it is. So let's move on with agenda item 10, and we'll do A, B, C, and D, and then we will break for lunch.
Good afternoon, Jonathan Hernandez, CWCB staff for the record, presenting agenda items 10, A, B, C, and D. These are changes to loans for the Chatfield reallocation project. And so I will be presenting the background of the project first, and then we'll go into each individual borrower. And I will be as brief as possible. I understand I had a 45-minute Windy Gap presentation the last board meeting, so I don't want a reputation here. This project site is south of Denver and Littleton. Again, it's a reallocation project. We have 5 borrowers. Center of Colorado did not seek an increase for their loan. They will bring cash to the project. And so we will talk about Central Colorado, Castle Pines North Metro District, Centennial Water and Sand, and then Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And again, that is 10A, 10B, 10C, and 10D. The project overview is Chatfield, obviously existing reservoir. The Corps has determined that 20,600 acre feet were available to move from the dedicated floodplain into a flood pool into a dedicated water supply pool. Table 1 in the board memos lists the current percentages of the different participants, and I've highlighted the 5 here that have funding through CWCB. The project cost is split really into 3 different elements. It's the first cost of storage. When the dam was originally built, federal government had a large portion of the dam. Now that part of that, the 20,600 is being reallocated to water supply. The water providers will now have to pay back the government for that portion of the dam. And the Corps is granted an exemption, so they're actually only paying back 41% of the cost. Environmental mitigation is required because it's a 12-foot rise. It will inundate existing habitat, and trees are impacted. And so there's going to be some on-site mitigation efforts as well as off-site to make the environment whole. Recreational modifications are necessary. This is a existing state park. There's lots of trails, lots of parking lots, swim beach marinas. All those will be impacted by a 12-foot rise. And so those are really the three costs here. The original cost of the dam, impacts to the environment, and then impacts to the recreational facilities on site. I brought these loans first back in 2014, and the loan was looking at an estimated cost of $145.5 million. The cost at the time was 132. I added through the loan a 10% contingency, hoping that we wouldn't have to come seek an increase. And the original schedule was the cost of storage was going to be due in about 2015. Storage would be allowed in the reservoir by 2020, and then remaining off-site environmental mitigation could last about till 2028. And so for that reason, we split the loan approvals into 3 contracts to help close these out sooner for the tasks that we could. Water provider agreements were signed by all project participants in October 2015. That also set the formation of the Chatfield Reservoir Mitigation Company, or CRMC. At the time the water provider agreements were signed, the project cost was estimated $134 million, and that was the official cost and really the amount of money that each participant had to bring to the table into their escrow account. So the provider agreements also set up the individual escrow accounts. These are jointly owned by the participant and the mitigation company. All cash was due up front, and then those borrowers that had CWCB loans more or less put the promissory note as the escrow. And now I review those on a month-by-month as invoices come in to disperse funds into those escrow accounts. The water provider agreement also provided a off-ramp, and you've heard Kirk talk about this earlier. The off-ramp stated that within 2 years, which would be October 2017, project cost would now be fully looked at again. Design would be more or less completed. They would have some bids in place. And if those cost estimates exceeded the $134 million by 10%, participants had the option to say, too much, we're backing out, fully, partially, or whatnot. And all participants had agreed to actually stay in the project. So none of the participants took this off-ramp. The CRMC was formed. Tom Browning is the current general manager. Tim Feen is the construction manager. I will point out that Tim is in the audience, and so he is available to ask or to answer any questions the board may have at the end of my presentation. Board of directors are listed here, all project participants, and our seat on the board at CWCB is Lauren Riss. Yeah, it stopped working. Moving on here. Updating here, but it's not updating there. If you could see the little screen, this screen is updating. Might not be much help to you. Well, I will continue, and I will use the little screen. So I was going to talk about the project updates. There would be a map of Chatfield. That's definitely not the map. Still not Chatfield, I apologize. The short end of the project update is that construction is starting to occur. Fall 2017, construction started on some of the different elements. There are many projects associated with this project, kind of sub-projects, if you will. And they are split into different contractors. So Concrete Express has the contract for the, I'm going off memory since I can't see here, the Plum Creek mitigation, the North Boat Ramp, and some day use areas. M.A. Mortensen is a contractor, and they're currently in the process of finalizing their contract to do the remaining on-site mitigation and recreational mitigation. And then Bellingham Marine will be the design build contractor for the Marina waterside project. All right, I'll move it. So here's a map of Chatfield Concrete Express. They're circled in red, and so those areas in red are the areas that they're responsible for. M.A. Mortensen will have the rest, and then Bellingham Marine is the marina. There is the remaining offsite mitigation, such as the South Platte mitigation downstream, and then the areas to the north of the map here. They're in the process of awarding that to Concrete Express as well. So construction is starting, contractors are out there, and parts of the park are being closed as needed. And here's a photo just to prove that construction has actually started on this project. Looking at the project cost estimate, again, in 2014, when I brought these loans to the board, I included a 10% contingency, and we're looking at $145.5 million. The water provider agreement set the official cost at $134, and the new October 2017 estimate is the $171 million. So that's 8,397 cents exactly per acre foot that each participant has to bring to the table. They are required by June 2018 to have that extra cash either in escrow or committed through an increase to the CWCB loan. I spoke about the anticipated schedule and why we split this project into 3 contracts. As of right now, it looks like all contracts may actually substantially complete in the same year. The cost of storage was changed. Instead of being due at the time the water provider agreements were signed, it is now due at the time that the water providers actually get to use the storage. And they're having a lot more success with on-site mitigation. And so the fear was that the off-site mitigation might go on till 2028. It's now looking that that may actually be complete by 2020 as well. So this is a good time to stop before I go into the individual borrowers and ask if there's any questions the board has of the project itself. And again, Tim Feehan with the mitigation companies here, if you have his need as well.
Questions for Jonathan or Tim at this time? Please proceed.
Agenda item 10A is the loan, the change to the loan for Central Colorado Water Conservancy District. And Randy Ray, the executive director, is also in the audience, and so he is available to answer any questions on behalf of Central as well. Their interest in the project is increasing the augmentation water to their ag users downstream of the project. They have existing conditional storage rights, and they will not need any additional water rights to be able to use this storage. Looking at their project financials, I've copied table 3 out of the memo, and it's up here on the screen. And it compares the loan what was approved in October 2015 and a new October 2017 estimate. In round numbers, they thought they were going to have to pay $27.8 million. For their cost now, it's $35.5, or a change of $7.7 million. Now we'll highlight, this shows a 20% grant for Western Mutual shares. Back in 2013, 2014, as this purchase was being negotiated, the board and Central agreed upon this 20% grant that CWCB would provide to help them purchase the Western Mutual shares that at the time were orphan shares that CWCB was holding. That grant was finalized at the same time the water provider agreements were done, and so that grant was finalized at that exact dollar figure, the $1,853,882 and yes, 25 cents. If the board agrees to extend that grant to the new revised project cost estimate, that increase would be $511,894 and exactly 20 cents. Because that grant has been fully dispersed and closed out, instead of simply increasing that grant, it would actually be a new grant approval, and that would be also put into the projects bill. The loan portion, Central is seeking $1.5 million approximately, and that is because they are limited of how much of their total debt they can have. Back in 2012, voters approved them to issue up to $60 million of debt, and that 1.5 takes up the remaining 60. So the remaining 3.4 million will be cash that they bring to the table. The collateral will remain pledge of revenues from the 2012 tax levy. Staff recommendation for the loan is as it is written in the 10A staff board memo, and that also on the same board memo is a staff recommendation for the grant. And with that, I will ask if the board has any questions of me or of Randy with Central.
Questions for Jonathan? Randy, would you like to address the board? Or is there any questions of Randy at this point in time? Don't believe so. Yeah, certainly if you have anything to say, we'd certainly like to hear that. If you...
My name is Randy Ray, the Executive Director for Central. Jonathan did a fabulous job. Why I kind of hesitated coming up here. I know you're behind schedule, but we sure appreciate working with the Water Conservation Board, and appreciate considering this increase, the request for the increase in the loan amount. Dramatically help out our members, and be happy to answer any questions anybody may have.
Don't see any, but thank you for being here today. Go ahead with your staff.
That I'll ask if you would like to vote on the staff recommendation for 10A.
Director Wells.
I move staff recommendation.
Motion by Director Wells, second by Director Yon to move staff recommendation, agenda item 10A. Further discussion? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. That moves us to Castle Pines North, which is agenda 10B. They are a Title 32 special district established in 1984, and they're looking to increase the permanence and reliability of yes, I apologize. Yes.
Jonathan, we also have the staff recommendation for the grant component of that.
Yes. I apologize. You do. Okay. So the grant will wait for the project's bill approval. Okay. So with that, I also would ask for a vote on the agenda item 10A, the portion for the grant.
Dr. Wells.
I thought I was doing both anyway, so I move staff recommendation on the grant increase.
Motion by Director Yon, or Director Wells, second by Director Yon to move staff recommendation 10A subsection B for recommendation for a grant. Further questions? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
All right, thank you. So 10B is Castle Pines North Metropolitan District and their participation in the project. They are receiving or seeking to purchase 1,006 acre feet. And they also will not need additional water rights or infrastructure needed to be able to use this water. Again, table 3 from your board memo is copied on this project. In round numbers, their project cost is increased by 1.81 million, and they are seeking to receive all of that from the loan. Back in 2014, these were approved at a 90-10 because that was our policy at the time. And we've now routinely review or approve loans for 100% financing. So they are seeking 100% of the needed increase for the loan. The collateral will remain a pledge of water activity enterprises for them, and they have no other debt on that revenue stream, so we are the only debt for that. Staff recommendation is as my board memo of 10B, and I will pause if you have any questions of me for this loan.
Questions for Jonathan? Go ahead.
That I will ask if the board would like to move staff recommendation.
Director Wells.
I move staff recommendation for item 10B.
By Director Wells, second by Director Yuan to move staff recommendation agenda item 10B. Further questions? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. Moving right along, that brings us to 10C, which is Centennial Water and Sanitation District's interest in this project. They are seeking to purchase 6,922 acre feet, and they as well do not need additional water rights or infrastructure to use this water. Their portion of the project cost has increased about 12.5 million, and they also are seeking a 100% increase for this loan to cover 100% of their project cost increase. They do have existing Series 2012 bonds, and we will remain on parity with that bond debt. And they do have a planned 30 cents per 1,000 gallon water use fee increase as part of their overall budget, and that is showing that they can still pay back this loan as part of their future revenue. The collateral for this loan will remain a pledge of operating revenues. Again, it will be on parity with their 2012 bond debt. And I will pause if the board has any questions or ask if you would like to move staff recommendation for 10C.
Questions for Jonathan? Recommendation, please.
Recommendation is per my board memo for the loan increase.
Director Wells.
I move staff recommendation for item 10C.
Motion by Director Wells, second by Director Yuan to move staff recommendation 10C. Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
This brings us to the last agenda item 10D, and it's the loan to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. As part of the project, they're purchasing 1,000 acre feet. It will be used as part of the environmental pool, which will allow them to manage releases during low flow days. Their portion of the cost is increased by 1.8 million. The original loan was done through an interagency agreement, and that was set at exactly the same cost as the water provider agreement cost, the 134 million. And so they need a new loan actually for of the 1,796,120,000. And this will be through a new loan because CPW has already started paying back on the original IAA. And so we cannot simply amend that. And with that, I will ask if you have any questions for the CPW loan or would move for staff recommendation.
Questions for Jonathan? We have staff recommendation before us. Director George.
I move adoption of staff recommendation.
Motion by Director George, second by Director Wells to move staff recommendation, agenda item 10D. Further discussion? Call for the vote. All those in favor signify by an aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Sure, certainly. Mr. Fian, would you like to come out to the podium and give us a brief presentation?
Well, good morning. My name is Tim Fian. I'm the construction manager for the Chatfield Reservoir Mitigation Company. And just a few brief words. I want to thank you for your support throughout the years. Obviously, if it wasn't for CWCB, Chatfield Reallocation Project wouldn't be a reality. So thank you for your continued support. Thank you for approving the loans today. It's definitely something that will pay dividends here quite shortly. I don't know if you had any specific questions about progress and what's going out there. It's been decades of work in terms of getting to the point where we actually are breaking ground, but all projects are moving forward right now. The mitigation work's moving forward on Plum Creek, as Jonathan pointed out, in all the day use areas, but the exception of a few are under construction as we speak. So we've got about a 2.5-year construction window. Hoping to have everything buttoned up by April of 2020 to allow the project participants to hopefully store water if Mother Nature cooperates. So things are moving forward after many years of planning. And again, thank you for your support, unless you had some particular question.
Questions for Tim? I don't believe so, but thanks for being here today. Appreciate it. All right, let's break for lunch. Let's be back in our seats at 1:15. We are in recess until then.